Yeah.
I'm going to run away and get some batteries. I've got an error message saying my keyboard's batteries are
Right,
running
welcome
out.
everyone. I think we're now broadcasting live. So warm welcome to everyone to this cutting edge research into practice event, Growing the Evidence Base. I'm Rosemary McLean, one of the NICEC fellows and a practitioner working in organizational career development, and we're joined today by numerous fellows who are going to be contributing. And just to say, my role really today is very much as a sort of overall chair, trying to keep us on time and to run through the schedule. And I just wanted to really say a few words about what we've got planned before we go into the first session. So here's the agenda. If you hopefully you've seen it already when you signed up for the event. I suppose what we're really going to try to do today is bring a conversation together between practitioners and researchers, and really focusing on different aspects of evidence and how you can enrich your work through this. But really we're keen to sort of encourage that dialogue. We've been running these cutting edge events for many years, in partnership with the CDI. This particular one I'm really excited about is because we do have some international fellows contributing to it, which is I think the first time. So we've got Peter dialing in from Australia, and Serena this afternoon will be dialing in from Canada. And on that note, I'd love to hear where you're all dialing in for. I'm actually in London. So in the chat box, why not say hello, introduce yourself, and tell us where you're dialing in from. We'd love to hear that and just see what breadth of experience we've got on the call today. So as you can see, we've got a bit of an itinerary planned. We're going to have a couple of significant breakout sessions where we can really have those dialogues in groups. We've got a nice break for lunch as well. And I think when we think about the topic of today, it seems to me that in a lot of professional fields, the importance of evidence is becoming more and more clear. It's not just in careers work, it's in other fields as well. I'm quite involved in occupational psychology and in HR, and the evidence base is very, the importance of the evidence base is coming through clearly. And I guess it's all about us innovating our practice, continuing developing ourselves, but also I think demonstrating that what we're doing is having an impact and is evolving. So that's why it's very exciting for practitioners. And I'm hoping that today, for those of you who are very much in practitioner mode, that you might get some inspiration around how you inform your practice, how you grow your practice. Possibly you might be prompted to think about doing some research. And those of you who are in research, it's obviously really helpful to also talk to practitioners about some of the challenges and to get insights from that. So that's really what we're hoping to develop with the dialogue. So we are, just to mention, we are recording the session. So if you don't want to have your video on show, you need to switch that off. We will be using the chat box, I think, as much as we can to stimulate discussion. So do continue to use that. And we will also have opportunities to take questions, but we're hoping we're expecting this to be quite a large group. So, you know, we're going to use the raise the hand if you want to ask a question. But what I would suggest is when speakers are talking that you can put some questions in the chat box and I'll try and pick up on some of those. So I think that probably sets us up nicely. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and we'll get Jane ready, who's our first speaker. So Jane, many of you will know Jane Artes. Jane was chair of NICEC for many years. Those of you who don't know much about NICEC, we are a learned society very much around innovating around career development, and we have a long partnership with the CDI. I know many of you, like myself, are members of both. But Jane always brings great inspiration and insight into her work, and has very deep experience both in research and practice. So Jane, I don't know if you want to get yourself ready to introduce the first topic, which is what do we mean by evidence? So Jane, are you ready to roll? And I see we've had some introductions from different parts of the globe. And have we got anyone else outside of the UK yet on the meeting? Do tell us if you are. Right, okay, over to you, Jane.
Okay, well, good morning or indeed good evening, depending on whereabouts you are. And thank you so much for joining our seminar today. We hope you'll find it really useful. And I'd just like to sort of endorse Rosemary's welcome. I hope you will find the discussion very, very useful for your work. My task this morning is to make sure that the first thing is that the slide won't go forward. Why not? Is to hang on. Is there any reason why the PowerPoint isn't working? Do we
Maybe
know?
Jane, just make sure put your cursor onto it. That sometimes helps to make sure you can move it forward.
No, sorry about this. Oh. It's really strange. There we go, got it. Okay, sorry about that.
Well done.
My task this morning is to have a look at some sources of data about career development work in the UK particularly, to look particularly at some of the purposes we put data collection to ask quite a sort of slightly provocative question about whether an absence of data can actually be a good thing, and perhaps whether one should use or create data. So that's the sort of territory that I'm looking at today. But before we start, I would just like to make a comment about vocabulary. When we often use the terms data and evidence interchangeably, but they really are rather different. I have always felt that data is just information, but evidence is more complex and can be used to account for something, for an idea or practice. My friends will know that I'm an avid police drama watcher, and there's an analogy here with police dramas where we might have information that the suspect is seen walking in the vicinity of a crime, but there needs to be much more evidence, such as a blood-stained knife or an opportunity, or importantly, a motive to be sure who done it. So perhaps evidence also involves values as well, that the police have to believe that the person is capable of murder before they even investigate. But perhaps we'll talk about it a bit later. We also talk a lot about the collection of data or evidence because we collect it all the time. We collect it as we go about our day-to-day activities. And sometimes we collect data actively, but sometimes it just kind of seeps in, doesn't it? Perhaps you might like to think about that for a moment. There's the active searching out of information, but there's also the kind of things that we assume, things we take for granted, things that we believe to be true. But thinking about sources of data for just a moment, I'd like to suggest that good data is all around us. Good data is generated by researchers in universities, government departments, research organisations, schools and colleges, workplaces, and by people like you. Recently, the term big data has come to refer to large-scale data sets, which are usually put into repositories and made available to other researchers and indeed to the public. And these are usually funded by government departments or charities. Good data is also usually published somewhere. One finds it in reports, online documents, peer-reviewed journal articles, excuse me, and good data spawns secondary analysis, often over many years. Some of you who are involved in this will know that good data can be quantitative, which involves numerical or statistical information, or qualitative, which involves narrative or verbatim information. And size doesn't always matter. There are robust data collections based on millions of responses and on just handfuls, tiny numbers. A lot of data collection is conducted by mixed methods by which researchers will often combine large numbers for statistical analyses and also involve themselves in some deep dives into the material via interviews with small samples of respondents to tease out detail and complexity. Good data is robust and fit for purpose. You may be familiar with the terms validity and reliability, but in case not, a valid approach or method of collecting data is one that is appropriate to the research question. And a reliable approach refers to the likelihood that that data collection will be similar if carried out at a different time or place. Reliability and validity are sometimes best seen in their absence. For example, research into the views of older employees about retraining following a period of redundancy is unlikely to be valid if all the respondents are employee managers in their 30s and 40s. So validity and reliability are sort of key bedrocks of the collection of good data, and a lot of effort is put into thinking about how these things will be achieved as data is collected. Data collection in an ideal world should add to our knowledge. Whilst that sounds very obvious, one of the important starting points for new data collection is to review what has been discovered already. Those of you who've done master's courses will know that a literature review is always part of your dissertation. That said, new circumstances, we think times, people, global pandemics, justify reruns of data collections and old data. And an important aspect of many big data sets is that they are longitudinal and collect the same sort of data over many years, enabling us to identify the triggers of change. By contrast, cross-sectional data is that collected from a population at a single point in time. Small-scale or local data collection can be just as robust and systematic as big data. For example, asking your students the same 3 questions over several terms or year groups can yield important insights into their career development and give feedback on your practice. It's working. So features of data, the rationale should be clear, the methodology should be robust. You can draw on data which is local, national, or even international. You might find that data you encounter is longitudinal over many years or simply something which has been done once. But importantly, it adds to your knowledge. And examples here of labour force survey, which is a big data set, a big government-driven data set. Action research is something that individuals on small groups of researchers often involve themselves in. PhD students are a rich source of information and data, and there's quite a lot of PhD work in the area of career development if you dig around for it. Project evaluations is another area where we have quite a number of those for you to see. But I guess you know intuitively about bad data, don't you? Can you give me some examples of things that you feel have been really bad, about how hidden agendas or vested interests has played out? How would you recognize dodgy data? Obviously, with a group of this size, what we can't do at this moment, perhaps, is to stop and have a chat about it. But maybe you could add some comments into the chat and we could pick those up later on in the day. But poor data is really something which there is sadly quite a lot of it around. We spoke earlier about data seeping in. Anecdotal data is like this, and it can quickly build into a personal form of evidence. But you need to challenge it. Similarly, bias can appear almost by stealth. Clients we work with may be particularly subject to this. When applied to the collection of data, researchers have to be aware of their own, as well as others' biases and assumptions. We sometimes euphemistically refer to researcher bias as their stance, because their stance is what drives them to focus on particular inquiries. I suppose going back to our TV crime drama analogy, it's the criminal's motivation, isn't it? Why do researchers, why do practitioners choose to focus on particular aspects of their work? It's because they're interested in it and they're motivated to. Data collectors don't choose inappropriate methodology deliberately. Well, not usually, anyway, not in my experience. But sometimes circumstances force it. A lack of resources being a key circumstance, but also demands are made by sponsors. Sometimes researchers have problems with access, or circumstances simply change. You can see how this happens. And that's why quite a lot of good research design includes risk assessment, because things go wrong, things happen. Getting the research questions right, though, is absolutely key, and it's a failing if it's done badly. Too broad or too vague, and the findings really won't tell you anything new. Lots of new researchers create overly ambitious research questions and then drown in their own data. Again, those of you who've experience of this, maybe you might like to comment in the chat, but it's important, it's really, really important to keep research questions focused. It's very easy to try to do too much in your project. Again, looking at another not so good feature of data sources, hidden agendas are tricky, not least because they are hidden. So be critical about who sponsors the research. Think carefully about political, academic, commercial benefit. Sometimes it's said that government-sponsored research is often used to justify what governments want to do. I didn't say that, did I? But yes, it has been said. And also, drug companies might perhaps want to show you how efficacious a drug is and maybe minimize some of the side effects. Again, I'm sure none of the better companies would do this, but hey, it has been said. And so if we're thinking about using research, either to review what's been done before or to look at something afresh, we need to be a little bit critical about, are there hidden agendas going on here? Who's actually interests are going to be served by this? And last but not least, communication of findings. Where it's poor, where data collectors and users can't understand the outcomes, then it's a particularly poor feature of the design. As skillful communicators, I don't need to tell you that what is said or written isn't always heard or understood, but may be widely reported or passed on anecdotally as if it was truth. So what I think we really need is a bit more of the kinds of things we might find in refereed journals and a bit less of unsubstantiated comments from powerful people, don't we? And it's certainly true that you can influence people without a great deal of actual evidence. So moving on, we need more of this and rather less of this. Why do we collect data at all? Well, there are lots of purposes for data collection. It can facilitate demonstration of trends or patterns. We've mentioned evaluation. You can evaluate or justify something which is new or existing. Data collection can help you improve your practice. It can help you gather information on the impact of your practice. It can also shed light on causes, correlations and associations, and provide management information, etc. And it can be a particularly useful thing to refute myths and assumptions, but also to focus on what works and maybe even at the extreme, establish a basis for new theories. Evaluation is particularly well used in our work, as I mentioned earlier, and here data collection is aimed to assess the value of a process, often to justify continuing investment in it. And you will see quite a lot of examples of that around as you do your own inquiries. However, establishing cause in careers work is a bit more tricky. A gold standard used in scientific research is the random control trial, where some subjects are given an intervention, a drug, a procedure, whilst others are not, and the different outcomes are captured. But in careers work, it is really pretty difficult to establish who is actually providing career information or advice, because it can be given by such a wide range of people and circumstances and experiences, as you well know. So establishing cause of, for example, a good career decision is very difficult to establish. However, we often talk more in careers work about establishing something which is referred to as correlations and associations. These things are more achievable and perhaps more appropriate for us to aspire to as an outcome. For example, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that career decision making is significantly associated with experiences of work, whether short or long term, and often, you know, not necessarily in ways that you would expect. So it's really important, if you're thinking about reading any research and using it in your work or actually conducting your own, that you give some thought to what purposes you have. You need to think about what is your purpose. You need to identify your research questions and be clear about what you want to know. As we've said, there are many reasons why data is collected, and different bits of information are then compiled into evidence. As we said earlier, the more elements, the better, the more likely you are to get that criminal conviction. If you create your own evidence, you are in control of it. If you use others' evidence, it may have been collected for a different practical or political purpose. So what kind of purposes do you take seriously? What would be most useful for you in your practice? Do you think about the sources or the purposes that lie behind data collection? Again, perhaps you might like to put some comments in the chat, because frustratingly, I can't hear what you're possibly thinking or wanting to say right now. You must forgive me, last week I had the mother and father of a cold, but I think it's just about gone now. So moving on, absence of data. We often think that all the answers have already been found. That simply isn't true. After years of tracking pay scales, we still don't really know why women earn less than men overall, although we've got some pretty good ideas. Although there is a lot of theorizing, we don't know why some people choose, say, full-time education over work-based learning. And we can't reliably predict who will make that choice, although we might be able to identify some indicators and patterns. There are many complex, unanswered questions about career development, and lots of very specific questions that you might have, which your experience or investigation might be able to answer. So we're suggesting, why not become research active? It means not only doing your own research, although we hope you will, but also getting to grips with others too, others' research too. You need to find a gap, something that you don't know, something that you would like to know more about, explore something new. You might find that you need to develop skills of reading and critiquing others' evidence. You might need to learn some new technology to do your own secondary research. For those of you who've been out of full-time education for a while, you'll find libraries are very different nowadays to what they might have been when you last studied. And you might want to consider undertaking primary research for yourself. In a way, primary research is the DIY, and the secondary research is probably going to find you reading a lot more. So we've talked quite a bit so far about data collection. We want now to think about turning that data into evidence. So how do we turn this into evidence? You can turn data into evidence, and some of the similar sort of guiding principles apply to this process as do to collecting the data. In other words, you need to think very carefully about what your aims and objectives are. You need to have very clear research questions. You need to sense whether or not there are underlying values or agendas at work. You need to think again about who will benefit, but particularly, what will the results be used for? Not last but not least, about thinking about whether you have the skills to do this. The last three of those bullet points on the slide there might be particularly relevant to you if you're new to all of this. And again, if you've thought about using evidence, you will probably have already thought about whether your own evidence is what you really need to focus on, or whether you really want to focus on trying to understand what's already been written. But when you start digging into an area, you might well find that there's already quite a lot of evidence. And one question that might beset you is, how much is enough? What do I need to do to actually make sure that all of this evidence collection and thinking about all these bits of evidence, how much is going to be enough for me? And you're beginning to use evidence practically to enhance your practice or to extend something you already know. I hope by now that you're beginning to think about something in your practice or the behaviour of your clients that warrants further investigation. But I hope also that you're beginning to appreciate that the collection of evidence is a bit more complex than just collecting information. However, because it's complex, it can sometimes be a little bit daunting. And so there are some sort of cautionary points to raise at this point about both using and creating your own evidence. The medical or problem-centered model of evidence collection is something is broken and needs to be fixed. May give you a really good starting point, but solutions in careers work are rarely simple. I can give you an example from my own experience. I was once on the steering group for the National Student Survey, which was originally designed to gather information on student satisfaction with their higher education course, in order to pass on this information to prospective students to help them choose which university to apply to. A good career-related aim, I thought at the time. The problem that was being dealt with by the national student was that information should aid student choice. However, after a year or two of running the survey, it became apparent that the National Student Survey was actually a good instrument for leveraging teaching quality as academic staff paid increasing attention to the results and made changes in line with student views. This was later used in a system of scoring universities as Olympic-like gold, silver or bronze on teaching quality. I'm sure some of you will have been involved in that process. However, more recently, the whole notion of student satisfaction has been challenged. And you can probably see why, because students usually have experience of just one of university. And so their satisfaction score is perhaps more of an assessment of their expectations versus experience. So for example, if you had low expectations and things turned out well, you might be pleased. But if you had particularly high expectations, you could well be disappointed and therefore not so satisfied. And so the whole idea of satisfaction as being a measure that is helpful to prospective students is beginning to be undermined. And furthermore, it's already been very well researched that students in universities do particularly well when they are engaged in their studies. And so now there's a lot of concern at the National Student Survey that maybe finding questions that measure student engagement rather than satisfaction with their courses might be the way to go. It might be a much better guide to teaching quality and a much better kind of information to pass on to prospective students. This example shows how a huge data collection exercise shifts its focus over time, and how the purposes can clarify and change, even when you thought they were really very clear at the beginning. It is difficult to find effective outcome measures for careers work. Your clients finding a job would be one measure, but does that really give evidence of career information, advice or guidance? Or is it actually evidence of the state of the local labour market? Similarly, client satisfaction surveys may or may not be capturing satisfaction with the process that the service is providing, as much as with their own personal outcomes. And outcome measures are very, very tricky in career development work. Many years ago, when I was involved more closely in careers work, I was told that if you're doing things well and working very closely with the client's own ideas, they don't notice that it's information, advice, education and guidance. They don't see it. And so think nothing has been done for them. And if you're doing it less well, maybe thinking of things that making suggestions that don't fit with their worldview or their aspirations, perhaps they're likely to reject those ideas and see them as inappropriate. And this little story was put to me by a slightly cynical careers advisor many years ago, who was really saying, it's difficult because much of what passes within career education, career development work is actually highly interpersonal and very much interpreted by individuals. Similarly, I once worked on a research project that found students didn't visit their careers service because they believed that you had to have a career plan before you visited your careers service. Others didn't visit their careers service because they already had a career goal and thought that the careers service was for people who had no career plan. So you can get some really interesting, but sometimes contradictory information from surveys, and particularly looking at measures, outcome measures for careers work can be difficult to pin down, and sometimes you can get some quite strange, quite tricky sorts of outcomes. That said, there's been some fantastic work done recently on establishing the economic benefits of career information guidance, which is well worth you digging it out and having a look at. Another point here, when we're thinking about using and creating evidence, is that whatever evidence you do come across, it does need to be clearly communicated. And very often, your task when you're thinking about using it is to try to synthesize evidence from several sources. And you need to be able to communicate it to both practitioners and policymakers. But often we find that research can be quite dull, can't it? Sometimes academic journals can be quite hard to read and quite tricky to understand and to follow. But there really is a gap in the market, it seems to me, for somebody to find ways of communicating findings in ways that will be understood. And deciding to act upon those findings, we need to remember, can be a highly political process. Just because you're sure of something and you've researched it and you've found evidence about it, it doesn't follow that your head teacher or the government department will invest in your recommendations, because there's another layer, isn't there, in terms of actually getting it to be not only understood and communicated well, but acted upon. And these things have to be thought about and planned for. And lastly, using evidence to inform practice or policy in careers work. In doing so, context plays a hugely significant role. What works in one company may not work in another, even in the similar sort of industrial sector. Subtle differences, or as we would call them, variables, occur. For example, there are different socioeconomic factors at play, different expectations, different local circumstances, different lived experiences. All these things, I hope, get you thinking really about how we use evidence, how we actually make it work for us. Okay, so it was my hope that by talking a little bit about this, it would begin to get you thinking, I can find out some information, I can do this, I can engage with this and become research active. So where do you start? Well, I think the first thing to consider is there already a source to draw upon? You know, has somebody already written about this, researched this, done some action research and local work in an institution or an organization near me? Can I connect with them in some way? But almost before you get to that stage, what do you really want to know? Again, it's back to the old thorny chestnut of make sure you can identify your research questions with great clarity. What drives your interest, and others, of course? What drives it? What are your motivations? Who do you hope is going to benefit? Are you primarily identifying an issue that you'd like to investigate because you want to help your clients, because you want to justify your role, because you want to get published? You know, who's going to benefit? What are the likely benefits going to be? And very importantly, how to focus in a world of complexity. We live in a world, don't we, where at the press of a keyboard, you're accessing literally thousands and thousands of pieces of information and collating those, collecting your thoughts, developing those into evidence that means something to you is quite a process. You might need help. Is there someone you can talk to about this? Somebody who you can share your ideas with? Somebody you work with? If you're a full-time or a part-time student, you may well find that there are people in your institution who can help you. But again, a lot of this hinges upon whether you're already in the frame of mind where you do reflect upon your own and others' practice. And so for some, particularly new people in terms of investigative work, you might find that there's a stage where you want to simply give yourself a bit of space to think about what's going on in my role, what could I change, what could do with looking at, what could be improved. And so there's almost, you could almost put those key questions into any number of different kinds of order. They're all important, they're all equally useful starting points and entry points for an investigation, be it a secondary one where you're looking at what's already been prepared and written, talked about, or whether you're planning your own primary research. There's much to think about, much to learn from others. So what we actually now need, don't we? We don't need fake news and random data. What we need is evidence. There are lots of organisations that produce evidence, and I thought, just to conclude my comments today, I would give you the opportunity to have a look at some sources of evidence. These are literally just as many as we could fit onto a slide. The slide will be available, but if you look quickly down this list, you will see some probably well-known names, but maybe one or two that you aren't quite so familiar with. All of these organisations are highly research active in the sphere of career development, and I'm sure if there are many more you could add to this resource list, and if you'd really like to do so, then please use the chat to do that. So that concludes what I would like to say today, and I do hope that you will enjoy listening to the examples that you have today. We've got an example from Australia looking at practitioner research. We've got an example from Canada looking at a very large collection of data, and another homegrown example from the UK, again looking at a very large data set and how that is used to enhance career development work. Exciting things to think about, and in particular, I hope, some ideas to start your discussions off well in the discussion groups that will follow our next presentation. So thank you for listening and enjoy your day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. I think that's really set us up, you know, you're thoughtful, walking us through some key aspects of building evidence and data. And we had some good comments in the chat, Jane, which I know you won't have seen. So before we move on to the next speaker, I might just bring up some of those points that people were making. When you were asking about examples of bad data, we had some comments about the the recent race report, which has gone down terribly, hasn't it? Which is a really good example of that. Underpinning that, where questions are loaded or of assumptions, where there's a vested interest in the results, where there's a spin. And as someone made a great point, that data is neutral. It is all about the interpretation of it. So that was some points that we had in the chat about examples of bad data. And we also had some comments about sources or the purpose of evidence, which were really around about the efficacy of our work, really, about looking at the impact of what we're doing, giving confidence to our users and to our clients and customers. And also we had some interesting comments, I think, about just recently about looking at the impact of our work, and someone was talking about one measure is around career confidence, which is an interesting concept, which we could explore. So I don't know, does anyone want, we've got time probably for if someone wants to actually voice a question. I don't know if Jane, you want to take down your slides now so we can get ready. So I don't know if anyone else wants to raise a question. You can raise your hand if you want to do that, and we can and you need to unmute yourself. So before we move on, has anyone got a burning comment or question they'd like to put to Jane or anyone else? I take that as no. I mean, it's a big audience, isn't it, with these events?
It's really difficult in a group of this size, isn't it?
Yeah, no, super. So, but Jane, I think you've really set us up well, and that's super. So we're going to now segue to our next input, which is from Peter McElveen from Australia, as Jane mentioned. But before we do that, I'm just going to, we're going to be sitting for quite a long time today. So I'm just going to suggest we do a little bit of a transition activity. So I would suggest you stand up if you're sitting down, get out of your chair, as I'm doing, and maybe just do a little bit of, shaking your shoulders and just look away from the screen for a few seconds even, to just really refresh your mind before we go into the next session. So I can't see you all doing this. You can see me doing it. So hopefully that's helpful. Just to, thanks, Jane. just do a little bit of movement. I mean, some of you may be at standing desks, I don't know, but so hopefully that's helped you. So without further ado, though, I'm assuming, Peter, you're with us. I can't see you yet. Are you there, Peter? You probably need to unmute yourself if you are there. Silence. Ashley, can you see if Peter's in the participants so we make sure?
I can't see him at the moment. I'm just emailing him to make sure he's here.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for Peter to join, perhaps he's got a slight delay at his end. He is, I lost track of what time of day it is there, but it's evening, I think, isn't it? So maybe that gives us an opportunity. Jane, is there anything else you wanted to add, or anyone else, to the discussion we've already had about evidence? We've got a few more minutes to do that.
I would be, I'm just sending a note. I would be very interested in hearing a bit more about dodgy data. I think I'm very worried at the moment that there is a lot of information out there which is taken as read, but it's actually very poor quality stuff. And I'm just interested to hear what people have to say about that, and whether they feel confident enough to know it's dodgy data. I mean, I think we all know that the former president of the US was prone to making statements without any evidence at all. But, there are other things that appear to be much more legit. And how do we differentiate those from the good stuff?
That's a good question, Jane.
Do we have any researchers out there? Or?
Hi, Jane.
Yep.
Sorry, let's turn on my camera a moment.
Is this Ruth coming through?
Yeah, Ruth. All right. Hi. I'm just trying to start my video, but it won't let me for some reason. I'm studying at the moment for a master's, so completely get where you're coming from with the data. And especially, I really liked your ideas around, how to measure the impact. Sometimes we're trying to measure the wrong thing. So like you said, we're trying to consider engagement rather than, I suppose, changed perceptions or whatever. It's about engagement. So yeah, but there's some work that was commissioned through the work that I'm doing recently, and in the report there was no mention of what the data was, who they spoke to, how many people they spoke to. And I just remember thinking, my God, we paid loads of money for this person to do this bit of research, and then a lot of the key information isn't there. And then I've also seen many reports that say, 86% of people said this, and it's like, yeah, but how many people were there? There might have only been 5 people. And I think it's really important to put that context there, because it can really skew the information otherwise. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's so easy, isn't it, that there's on the resource list, those of you who were able to read it quickly enough might have spotted that I included a radio show called More or Less. Does anyone else listen to this? Let's say Lynn nodding. I can't see who's nodding with most of you have got your cameras off. It's a fantastic program, I think, because what it does is take headlines like that, 86% of people think X, and actually strip down what that means. and they've done some fantastic programs recently on statistics around COVID and things that politicians say. And sometimes they find that what the politicians say are fair and true and reasonable. Other times you can see how statistical material is stretched beyond its limits, really. And we're in danger of being misled by the headlines. As with much in life, the devil is in the detail, and having the time to dig down into what the data is actually saying and what it's actually reporting, we don't always have time to do we? We use headlines to shorthand that process. And so all I would encourage you to do is keep reading, really, and keep a critical eye open. Yeah, good point.
I think on that, Jane, I think most people's grasp of statistics is very rudimentary, isn't it? And the way that the media spins statistics is very misleading. So just having a better grip on basic statistics is quite helpful for everyone, I think.
Yeah, yes. I should know the answer to this, and probably Lynn or somebody else from CDI will, but does the CDI do some basic courses in statistics, perhaps, or some basic...
I can answer that.
Putting somebody on the spot here, and I don't mean to, but...
No, not at the moment. And actually, I used to teach statistics when the forerunner of one of the forerunners of the CDI, the ICG, used to do a lot of psychometric testing things. And the really useful sort of little, easily manageable books on statistics were all in the realm of statistics for teachers. 2 or 3 really good little books. And Rosemary, I can see Peter's arrived.
Yes, I was just going to say, welcome, Peter.
Hello, nice to be with you.
And thank you so much for taking up your evening to join us. I think we're much anticipating your input. So if you want to get started with your slot, we've got you scheduled till 12:15. Sorry, not 12:15, 11:30, Peter. So that's your timely slot. So welcome. And are you happy to share your screen now?
I will. Sure. I'll just get it going. And you with me? And you just want me to get into it?
Just get into it. Yeah.
Okay. How's that? Is that coming through?
It's coming through. You just need to put it on slideshow. Great.
Hold on. How's that looking?
Perfect.
That's okay. All right. So anyway, look, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here, and it's lovely to see some familiar faces. Lynn, lovely to see you. It's been ages. I wanted to take this time to share with you some ideas about doing particularly quantitative-based research, but in practice settings. And I have some examples that I'm happy to talk about as we go, but what I really want to do is overview some of the key concepts that need to be kept in mind when doing research in the real world, so to speak. And it's one of the things I want to emphasize is that the research done by practitioners is in no way inferior to the research done by academics. In my view, it's actually far more important because it's contextualized, it's focused on practical outcomes. But beyond that, the methods are essentially the same as what we would do in pure research in a university. So you can learn from what we in the sort of research community would use and put it into your own situation. So look, just a little bit of background first about me. My research team is Accel, is the logo there. It's a mouthful, that's why we have Accel, but we're basically a multidisciplinary team, mainly psychology, education, some sociology, some communications people. And we're very much focused on employability. What are those qualities within a person that enable them to survive and thrive in the labour market? We know that there are all sorts of contextual reasons why people, are less employable than others, and that's important, but that's not our focus. We're very much focused on some of the psychological qualities that enable a person to do better in the labour market. And also, we're very much focused on those professions and trades which are essential for communities to thrive. So in the professional end, we'd have the nurses, the teachers, and then in the trades end, and recently one of my PhD students just graduated, we were looking at diesel mechanics working in agriculture. So we try to take the whole broad spectrum of those vital occupations. And that requires us to do some research in the real world, with small businesses and large industries as well. And we also have a particular bent on regional and rural research. There's an enormous opportunity for our professional area to contribute to regional rural community development around the world. It's not just necessarily Australia. Your country has a great rural tradition, and I think that we have a role to play in that as practitioners and as researchers. So let me start with a real world scenario. This piece of research was done in a counselling setting in which we were providing career counselling, a very short career counselling, what we would refer to as drop-in service. So it's almost like a screening interview. So a person would attend the counselling centre. They would then be given an opportunity to describe their problem, what they wanted to solve, what's going on. And then a decision would be made, okay, you probably just need some information or be pointed in the right direction to go and get some resource, or yes, you probably do need some further career counselling work. So it was very much a triage interview in that sense. But what we found from this was that our clients actually improved very, very quickly. But the problem is we didn't know why. We thought it was all to do with the wonderful techniques that we were using, could have been, but we didn't actually know. So in terms of providing the service to our clients, we wanted to identify what was a crucial factor in that short interview intervention that we had with people. And it's these types of practice-based problems that if we focus our research attention on solving these practice-based problems, we'll push our field forward in a great way. So in this particular case, it was a standardized interview following a fairly well standard format. And the time limitations on that situation actually helped us find what we wanted to find. So I'll come back to it later, but I've sort of given it away down the bottom of the footnote there. There's a citation, but I'll come back to it as an example because I want to sort of keep you thinking, okay, well, how did they do that in the real world, in a practice situation? First, I want to emphasize a mindset that's crucial to doing research in practice. And, there are some terms that you'll find in the literature like evidence-based practice, scholar practitioner, practitioner scholar, scientist practitioner. There's a whole bunch of different expressions. What we need, and when I say we, I mean us as a broad profession of career development practitioners and researchers, are practitioners who are really, really interested in advancing the knowledge base of our profession. But one of the challenges that we have in sort of bridging that theory, research, practice problem, and it is a problem, I teach postgraduate courses in career development, so I do come across students who just want to be able to do stuff and help the clients, and that's all good. But what we want is to create a system where we can be feeding knowledge back. One of the key issues that I find with my students is differentiating between what's evidence and what's experience. A reflexive practitioner needs to know the difference between their own personal experience and how they've implemented all of their methods of their counselling and their career education in their context. That's absolutely essential, of course. But the other thing is to be aware that there are literally thousands of published studies and almost 100 years of evidence that's built up over time. One of the frustrations I have is the reinvention of the wheel, and ironically I've got a wheel here in this diagram, is that we seem to be doing the same thing over again, coming up with the fresh idea from wherever, but we seem to have that 20 years ago actually, and it's just come back again. And that's a problem because we're going nowhere if we don't push forward into new domains. So that requires all of us to be very much aware of, well, where have we been? What do we actually know? What have we proven really, really well over the decades? And one particular theoretical model I often talk about is Holland's theory of vocational interests and work environments. That theory has been tested over and over again, and the evidence is very clear. It predicts occupational outcomes decades into the future. Now, people can argue about whether psychometric instruments are very useful. They can be, or whether they're not. They can be not sometimes. But the evidence is very clear on this particular theory. I don't know too many theories that have enough evidence to indicate that they can predict pretty clearly a person's occupational choice 30 years out. That's good evidence. But not many people are aware of that evidence because we just simply move on to the next fad or to the next trend. So what I ask my students and my research colleagues is to try and differentiate between what's my experience as a practitioner and what's the experience of the hundreds of thousands of other practitioners who've done this over the last however many hundreds of years. But we also need a bit of a framework for doing evaluative research in practice. Now, one of the neatest little books that I've come across is by now Emeritus Professor Jim Athanasiou. Jim was at University of Sydney and University of Technology, Sydney, for many years. And prior to that, he worked in what was then the Australian Job Search Centre, the Commonwealth Employment Service. So Jim had a long, long experience of working with people who were unemployed and then taking that expertise into teaching rehab and career counselling at University of Technology, Sydney. This little book has a lovely framework to follow, and it's literally that thick. You know, it's not one of those great tomes that drives you to distraction. So some of the key questions in this framework is they're written there on the screen, and that is basically the framework for doing evaluative research in practice. One of the dimensions of that I'm going to be talking more about is focusing on measuring specific variables that we intend to affect change in for our clients and our students. So what are the measurables? Well, firstly, let me give the caveat. I do not reject qualitative research. It's good stuff. I teach my PhD students qualitative research. I publish qualitative research. I totally accept it. The paradigm war from the 1980s and 1990s is over. At least in psychology, it's over. We don't argue about this anymore. We accept qualitative research. But what I want to do is focus on the measurable. Now, there's all sorts of concerns around by measuring, that's what you end up targeting. And I agree to that to a certain extent. For example, in Australia, our national program for literacy and numeracy testing has, from some people's points of view, created this culture where teachers are teaching to the test. Now, that's not proven, or it's still a contestable assertion, but I don't want you to have the impression that we should just simply measure a small range of variables. We've got to take in a bigger picture. Which brings me to this particular framework. This is by Patrick Rottinghouse and his colleague. What I like about this framework is that it gives the context of the person and it gives you a place to focus. It also aligns quite nicely with Mark Savicus's career construction theory, which is quite popular around the world, particularly in the United States. Like Mark's theory, this one leans back on a personality theorist, Daniel McAdams. McAdams made this argument that psychologically, there are three ways of knowing a person. There are the dispositional traits. Those are those things that do change over time, but they're slow to change. So, for example, the big 5 personality traits: person's openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and emotionality or neuroticism. Those traits can be used to classify a person as similar to other people. They can change, and we can measure them. The next part of a person that McAdams talks about is their characteristic adaptations. These are the qualities that we can learn. And one of the most important qualities that we can focus on and measure is self-efficacy and career adaptability. A person's self-efficacy can be absolutely focused on a specific behaviour. So it's quite important that we sort of differentiate between I'm a confident person, which is very different to I have self-efficacy for that specific behaviour. So it might be I have self-efficacy for mathematics. I have self-efficacy for making career decisions. That's very different to I'm a confident person. And so the good thing about focusing on self-efficacy is it can be taught. So as a practitioner, I was always interested in what we could do to help a person go forward, but also to know what we couldn't do. There's no use spending lots of energy trying to change a person's conscientiousness within the scope of 3 counselling sessions. That's not going to happen. But in 3 counselling sessions, we can turn a person's self-efficacy around, and that will help them move on to other behaviours in terms of job search behaviour or making career decisions, which are crucial outcomes for us.
Peter,
now, the other part.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I wonder if you could put the slide on full screen, because it's a few people aren't seeing it as clearly.
Right.
That's helpful. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. What I might do is reshare it and see what happens. Okay. How's that? Rosemary?
It's not come up yet. Sorry, I've disrupted your flow, but it was such.
No, that's okay. It's all right. We'll get it right. Tell me what you can see now.
It's not shared. Sorry, just.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. We'll get there.
Sorry, everyone, disrupting it.
How's that?
It's
now
coming.
You should be able to.
Yeah.
Can you see that now?
It's just about coming. Yeah. If you could put it on slideshow, we'll see it, I think.
Right. How's that? How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Okay. But I've got to go back one. So the third dimension of a person that McAdams talked about was their career narratives, their stories. And that's what makes a person unique. And that's where interview-based research is crucial, because it's the story that a person tells that makes them absolutely unique. But what we can do beyond the stories of a person's life is get into measuring the important traits and the characteristic adaptations that are going to affect their career decisions. So this is a nice organizing framework. So if you're thinking about doing some research in your practice, you might go, okay, well, what parts of the person are we actually interested in at a very, very broad level? But we can make it even more specific. Now, before, did that work? Can you see the model of interest, Rosemary? Great, all right, they're working. So this particular model, I mentioned it before, this is Holland's model of vocational interests. And it's also a model of work environments. That's an important part of the theory that people often forget, is that mirroring the realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional interest types are work environments. So the work environments part has been dropped out, though. There's been less emphasis on it over the recent decades, but it's still there, and they still can be classified in terms of patterns of these interests. So the thing about these interests is they are quite stable. They can be developed, they are really stable. But the most important thing is that they can be measured very, very easily and very quickly, which makes it attractive for practitioners. And there are free measures out there that we can use. So we can come back to that later. Here is a slight variation on that theme developed by Terry Tracy in Arizona. What Terry came up with was the idea that, yes, the Holland model of RIASEC, vocational interests, is great. It doesn't quite work all that well for young kids. But what Terry found was that kids are very, very adept at picking prestige of occupations early in life. I know there was a recent study in the United Kingdom where prestige was really brought out in a sample of kids. Terry's got a measure that you write to him, he will send it to you free of charge. And the good thing about this measure is that it can be used in career education, in career counselling settings. And what it gets is the realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional interests, as well as the kids' prestige. But Terry's created products that comes with this, which relates it to specific occupations. So it can be a really, really useful education tool if you're in a classroom or if you're working with a person one-on-one. All right, I'm getting there. I know everyone gets bored to tears with theories, but it's important that we find out what we want to focus on. So if this one, the Social Cognitive Career Theory by Steve Brown and Bob Lent, is fairly well predominant in the research literature. Unfortunately, it does not have a lot of practitioner-based research behind it. That can change because every single factor that you can see on that screen, we can assess in practice. So if we're looking at the left-hand side there where it says person inputs, that's those predispositions. That's the sort of stuff that we put as personality traits. The core of social cognitive career theory is the self-efficacy beliefs and the outcome expectations. These can be rendered down to two simple statements. Self-efficacy is, I believe I can do something. Outcome expectation is, and if I do, I will get. So there's a logical chain. So in terms of the research into this particular theory, there's a very strong body of evidence which sort of connects up all of those arrows which point to where we want our clients to be. We want our clients to be feeling self-efficacious and having expectations for the future, because that's what drives their behaviour in terms of their performance. Now, one particular thing that I often talk about that I'm interested in is the self-efficacy for searching for jobs. And I'll mention it again later. One of the best predictors of a person putting in a job application, which you've got to do to get a job, is having self-efficacy for doing that. It's not rocket science, but we can teach people to do that. And focusing on the beliefs of how to change self-efficacy requires a focus on 4 things. And I'm going to show you a diagram which indicates those 4 things. Now, this particular piece of research is what I refer to as the missing link. Because on the left-hand side there, you've got the Holland model, the so-called NICEC framework of occupational interests, realistic, investigative, artistic, and so forth, which is a really good predictor of people's choices and outcomes into the years. Then on the right-hand side, we've got the sources of self-efficacy, which is basically mastery, actually achieving a behavior, getting it right. So practicing something until you get it right. And then vicarious learning, which is observing other people. Now, vicarious learning is really, really interesting because I know there's a lot of emphasis on mentoring. See so many programs on mentoring, and that's important. What we don't think about often in terms of vicarious learning is that people need to be able to relate to the mentor and say, he can do that, he's like me, therefore I can do it. If you present a mentor to someone and they're like a superstar, most middle-aged academic slobs like me will go, no chance of doing that. He's too fit or whatever. But we often don't think that through because that vicarious learning factor is so important in terms of people building their own confidence. They need to be able to see their peers doing it. I reviewed a study several years ago for the Journal of Vocational Behaviour, which was eventually published, which investigated adolescents' self-efficacy for themselves and then their self-efficacy for as a group. So as personal efficacy and a collective efficacy. And what this particular piece of research found was that those kids who believed in themselves and their efficacy and their peer group actually made much better career decisions. So that gives us an opportunity to think about, okay, how do we develop them one-on-one and as a peer group? And that's where that vicarious learning is coming in. They're pushing one another's efficacy. Now, the third one is the verbal persuasion. Is what it is. It's really trying to convince people, yes, you can do this, you can do this, you can do this. I think counselling is probably a form of that. And one of the other factors that drives a person's self-efficacy is their emotional arousal, whether they're feeling anxious or hyped up and excited. So what this missing link research tells us is that all of these things which we can teach for, which we can counsel for, in terms of self-efficacy, can actually contribute to a person's occupational interests. So we could develop a whole intervention around this particular model here and do it in practice. So using this research to inform the design of an intervention. Now, this is just a diagram of an outcome that I did with my colleague Harsha Pereira. Harsha and I were really, really interested in what traits predict a student's interest in a STEM career. And like in Australia, STEM in the UK has got lots of political energy behind it. What we were able to do was to model people's Holland interest types to try and use these to predict who would be going into an engineering degree. Now, this is the engineering group here. What we were able to do was to use this latent profile modelling, and it predicted about, literally there, 2.4 times the chances of going into engineering if they had that specific profile versus other types of profiles who went elsewhere. So the point I'm trying to get across here is latent profile analysis is a very complicated statistical procedure, and I'm delighted that Harsha can do it because I'm not all that skilled at it. I'm better at other things. There's my self-efficacy. But when we as practitioners see a person come through the door, we don't go measure each single variable and do a score on each single variable. We look at them and go, that one's a bit of an R and I and a bit of this and a bit of that. Well, that one's a this and a that. That's our sort of clinical intuitive judgment working. This particular statistical procedure, latent profile analysis, sort of becomes the mathematical equivalent of our clinical brain making those judgments about our clients and how they present for counselling. So it's an example I wanted to put to you, because what I'm trying to say is that your expert thinking, the way you intuit your client's typology, we can now replicate that sort of statistically. That's a great opportunity for us to learn more about how practitioners are actually making really precise judgments about their people, because they've got that stuff in their mind. They're actually experts. Now, here's the caution. As much as I've rabbited on about we can measure traits, we can measure interests, we can measure this, we can measure that, we have to be really, really careful about the language that we use. I get a little bit concerned when I hear this. I'm an XYZ, I'm not a this. People put themselves into categorical boxes. We've got to stop doing that ourselves and stop talking like that, because our clients are picking up on it and our politicians are picking up on it. We have to stop using that categorical language, because it reflects a way that we think. And it becomes limiting, because if a person says, well, I'm a this and I'm not a that, they've instantly broken their self-efficacy for doing something more than what they are currently doing. It's a limit. So in counselling, that's something I used to pick up on a lot with people. I'd hear people say, oh, you know, I'm just what? No, you're more than a just. So having said and extolled all the wonders of interests, we've got to be careful about how we talk about it. So what do we measure? Well, we measure what's effective. That's the most important thing. We have an extraordinary amount of evidence which indicates that career development interventions are effective. The most recent study on that is by Sue Whiston and her team. Sue's done a number of meta-analytic studies over the past 2 decades, and we don't need to look much further than these big meta-analytic studies if we want to sort of get some thoughts about, okay, what's most effective for my clients in my situation? Now, the way meta-analytic research works is sort of like a correlation, average of correlations of effects between various variables. And we look at the magnitude of effect. Now, here's the funny one I always like. Counselling has a very large effect size. So you've got to think it's got to run from 0 to 1. So at 0.83, that's about as large an effect size as you're going to see in your life. That's amazing. Some of the other effects, this is self-report inventories. As long as they've got a client, a counsellor or a practitioner involved with them, you can actually get more out of a self-guided activity. That's one of the things that Steve Brown found in his early meta-analysis in 2002, is that when you combine the ingredients of career interventions, like doing a formal assessment, having an interview, talking through the results with someone, they add their effects. And what is very, very clear is that the least effective is straight, I don't even want to use the term computer guided because it's an old-fashioned term, but just straight information-only website delivery. It's really, really important resource. I mean, in Australia, we've got My Future, which is fantastic. I know you've got some good stuff there in the UK as well, but pure information only is the least effective. It's like leading a horse to water and they just don't drink. So what we need is some kind of intermediary to make bring that informational service to life. So personalisation matters, absolutely. Now, that effect size there for individual counselling on this sort of narrow view on it is very, very large, but there's a limitation on that because it's only a small number of cases in that data. But you can see down the bottom, computer alone, an effect size of 0.06. Well, that's the lowest in the column. And I'd like to say this, as much as I really appreciate those online services, I think our political leaders think that that's all that's required. We'll have a beautiful website, they have lots of flashing lights and beautiful pictures and a couple of videos here and there. We can move on. No, because that's just the beginning. And we can use this evidence to make that point. So what's it actually changing? This is important stuff. So it's changing how people can make decisions. It changes how they come about their identity. Now, the one I'm really most interested in is this one, to create a decision-making self-efficacy. If someone believes that they can actually make an effective decision and move on. Now, we can measure every single one of those things easily in a very short period of time. So, going back to my earlier point, well, if we measure what we want to develop in people, we can get their decidedness working. So, you know, this is, sorry about the statistics, but that's just the fun of it all. What I wanted to point out to you tonight was that developing self-efficacy, we're saying here it's, you know, 54% of the variance explained in self-efficacy, which is a lot. Mastery experiences was the only one of these two statistically significantly contributed to 0.36, this one 0.04. So why is that important? Well, because if verbal persuasion statistically has no relationship with self-efficacy in this particular study versus learning experiences, don't waste your time talking, because the talking ain't working. It's about focusing on doing activities. So we can get from this type of evidence the stuff that we need to focus on and the stuff that we shouldn't bother with. But look at vicarious learning. That's watching my peers. 0.23, yeah, and it's statistically significant. So knowing this helps us make better decisions in practice. So how are we going to do this evaluation stuff? Two things to think about when you're doing evaluation. Evaluating the process of what we do, and then the outcomes. The outcomes are the important things, but knowing the process will tell you more about the services that you offer and what's more effective and what's not effective. So we want to know, what are those things that get our clients to actually come to our services in the first place? What are those things that get them to engage with what they're offered rather than just sort of passively wanting to be delivered something? And then the important bit, what are those factors that get them to use the knowledge in a sustained way into the future? So using the service, engaging in what they've been offered, and then applying it when they walk out the door.
Peter, sorry to interrupt again, Rosa. Just giving you a sort of 5-minute timing.
Thank you.
That's
Sorry.
okay. No worries. Thank you.
And one of the things that we need to focus on in our research, which was that stuff at the front, was working alliance, the relationship between the counsellor and the client. Now, I'll skip over this, but part of that research that we were looking at the beginning, I said to you, well, what are the things that actually contributed to our clients' gains? We measured the task, the bond, and the goal of the working alliance. And it was the setting of the task that actually contributed to the students' reduction of their negative outlook. So we went, oh, okay, let's focus on the task every time they come into that drop-in session to try and get rid of that negative thinking. So what are we actually going to do as a way to evaluate this stuff? The time frame is crucial. it's got to be the immediate stuff. What's happening right here, right now in the classroom, in the session, and then into the long term. One of the things I wanted to emphasize to you is don't just focus on the career-related variables. I've got here an example, the K10 for mental health. What we know is very, very clearly in the case of job search, for example, a person's mental health status influences their engagement in jobs search activity. So we need to be measuring that as well, because our services might actually be doing more than helping someone make a good career decision. And focusing on what's the manifest and the latent. The latent are those things where we use questionnaires to measure stuff. We can't directly see self-efficacy, but we can create little items that reflect it. And the directly observable is, of course, my favorite example, the number of jobs that you're searching for. I'll skip over this because I'm running out of time. I talk too much. Okay, now people say to me, oh, but where do you get this stuff? Well, you get it straight from the authors. Google Scholar is a really easy search tool to use. You type in what you want to measure, career interest, self-efficacy, there'll be a million measures. The ResearchGate is a place where researchers put up their author versions of their papers, which the publishers don't own. So it's another great source of getting materials. An excellent database that's available now is PsychTest. It has literally thousands and thousands of little short questionnaires that you can use. But the best thing is write to the authors. Don't be shy, just write to them. I wanted to sort of very quickly go over the best designs to be using in practice settings. The waitlist control group has a bit of an ethical caveat around it because it requires you to deny a service to someone for a certain period of time. And that can be a bit problematic, but even very basic pre-post measures is outstanding. But if you can go post measure using simple measures, that's real evidence. It's really beautiful evidence because they're not just psychology students filling out surveys. But speaking of surveys, they're good too. Now, there's lots of excellent survey platforms out there now. So Lime Survey, Qualtrics, SurveyMonkey, they're all relatively cheap and they're easy to use. Very easy to use. And the thing about surveying your clients on a mass scale is within 5 to 10 minutes, you can get enough meaningful data to determine what are your clients' needs. And this stuff is very feasible. Work with a university. I'll jump to the bit at the bottom. University academics need practitioners. Why? Because practitioners are the site of where they can get data. They need data to publish articles. They need data to get research grants. They need practitioners. We need practitioners. So you've got something that the academics want, but they've got skill sets that you can really use, such as getting those ethical clearances for collecting and publishing data, getting access to those databases online and publishing those journal articles. And that's the crucial bit. I've always encouraged practitioners to publish journal articles. Please, please publish journal articles because your stuff is real. It's not pie in the sky. So that's where we began. And I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Peter. That was, I don't know about the rest of you who are practitioners in the room, but I think that was a very validated input around the centrality of the practitioner's experience and the practitioner work and the link with research. So I found that really motivating, Peter. I don't know if anyone's got any particular questions or comments. We are going to go into breakout sessions very shortly, but if there's anything anyone wants to raise their hand and make a comment or put a question to Peter while Peter, I'm not sure if you're staying for the breakouts or whether you're dropping off now. It's probably, what time of day is it with you in Australia?
Not too bad.
No, that's fine then. So yeah, very, very useful. And I think, you know, what I took from that was just, you know, that point you made about Holland and actually all the body of evidence around Holland, but the shift towards fads, you know, that very often is the case, not just in careers work, but in other domains as well, isn't it? That you want to the next thing rather than consolidating on what we know, where the evidence is already. So I was very struck by that, that point as well.
Yeah, I mean, that, Rosemary, to me, that's the surprising thing, is that, you know, literally as a field, we're 100 years old. We know what we're doing. We just keep reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the other thing I was really struck by, you know, which is very aligned with the way I think about the work, is that role of self-efficacy has just been very central in the way you were talking about it. And I guess as practitioners, that's the interface. And I think the other thing I was struck with the way you talked about the way we intuit the work, you know, we intuit with, it's that unconscious competence, isn't it, that we have, and we're not necessarily, you know what we're doing while we're doing that. So I thought that was really, really helpful, really useful. Anyone else want to say anything? Well, I think it's timely now. We've had some great inputs from Jane and Peter to give you an opportunity as researchers and practitioners to have that conversation in smaller groups. So what we're going to do now is we're going to put you into breakout rooms. I'm just going to...
I'd love to stay for a bit longer if you could allow me to. That'd be okay.
Yeah, of course. I'm just going to get up. We've got some questions just to prompt the discussion, but you don't have to go with these questions. I'm just going to put my screen up there. Let me just get the to this point. Okay. Can you see that question? There I go. Right. Can everyone see that? You don't necessarily have to do this, but we just thought, you know, come together in your groups. Some of you will be more, you know, research orientated, some of you more practitioner orientated. So maybe an opportunity to think about some of the sort of things that you've thought about in research, what you've done, how you've gone about it, what conditions helped you to do that, the benefits you got, and maybe something about, if you haven't done any practitioner research, what opportunities do you see for doing it? And I think Peter's input was really helpful for that. It's just, you know, really thinking about the work as we're doing it, what would help you. But you can talk about what you like. You can use the time how you want. We're allowing 35 minutes for this, so you might want to factor in a short break within your group as well. We're going to now randomly put people into groups. It will be for 35 minutes, so you will be brought back automatically to the main session. So Ashley, are you able to put people in the groups now? So that should happen. You should have a prompt coming up on your screen to join a breakout group, and we will come back together again in 35 minutes. So hopefully everyone's been allocated to a group. If not, put something in the chat box, and we'll see you later on. I'm back now. That's exciting. Yeah, everyone's coming back. It's always a bit of a worry with breakouts that you're actually literally breaking out and breaking away, but it's good when people come back. So welcome back, everyone. Obviously, we're very curious to know what you've been talking about, which we won't know, but hopefully it was a useful discussion. We've got one more input before lunch, but would like to take this opportunity just to see if anyone wants to share things from what was discussed in the breakouts, you know, any particular high points or new insights. You know, you put them in the chat box if you'd like to. And I was particularly interested in any ideas you had around opportunities for further research, and maybe what might be some of the barriers and enablers for practitioners to do more research. So if you've got any thoughts on that, do put that in the chat box, or anything else you want to share there. But would anyone be brave and want to just share a little bit of the conversation that took place in their group without breaking any confidences? Would anyone like to raise their hand and say something about what was discussed, just to give us a flavour? Anyone wanting to do that? Yes, Lan, would you like to do that? Yeah, maybe if you unmute yourself, then you will look forward to hearing.
We were discussing about the barrier or and the opportunity that of working online, virtual, deliver the service virtually. Some of us were worried about the we cannot control the confidentiality, or if we won't break any ethical code. But also, in my opinion, I put my idea to our group is that it is an opportunity as well, because it won't have you reach the client farther than the travel distance that you can cover, or it can be provided to the student who has limitation limited access to the service. And also you can combine multiple tool or media in your session as well. So it could be an opportunity. It could be viewed as an opportunity as well. And with the change in the working environment, where people are working remote more and more, deliver the service virtually would also give the kids a chance to get used to working and coordinate virtual as well. So it is another, like in my opinion, it could be win-win situation if we can if we carry it out, or if we structure it right. So it was what I bring to the discussion.
It sounds like you had a really good discussion about just changing your service mode more online and what the opportunities around that. So great, thank you. And I see there's a few comments in the chat box coming through about the impact of the pandemic on the quality offer there. That is an interesting topic that to look at. And yeah, thanks Claire for your comment about the sessions shaping the framework for thinking about impact. Any other topics around opportunity I think would be interesting to see, because I think it sort of speaks to what Lynn's going to now come and talk about, which is the way that the CDI are strengthening its support for research and evidence-based practice. So I think the CDI, I'm sure, will be very interested in, you know, where we see opportunities for doing more research as practitioners in particular. So do keep those ideas coming. But would anyone else like to raise their hand and say anything before we move on? That's fine. So I think then maybe keep the comments coming in the chat box. And I will now invite Lynn to come and tell us a bit about some exciting things she's working on behalf of the CDI. So Lynn, over to you.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen then. Oops. I'm doing slideshow and I want it to stay. There we are. Okay, you can all see that okay? Right. I'm going to have to get rid of people because I can't see. Oh, well, never mind. Right. Hello, everybody. I think probably a number of you know that I very much straddle the partnership of NICEC with CDI. I have a quite large foot in each camp, and so it's really with both hats on that I'm speaking here. And I'm, as well as talking about the evidence-based repository, which is what's obviously was given as the title of my session. Things have moved on quite a lot since we designed this program 2 or 3 months ago. So I am also going to talk about practitioner research developments, and actually the evidence-based repository has moved a little more slowly than we thought, and the practitioner research developments have perhaps moved a little faster than we thought, but we keep trying to gallop both horses. So just focusing on an evidence-based, and particularly on an evidence-based repository, my key message here is we need this. And I've put just a few points there which come from a Career Matters article that Siobhan Neary and I wrote in January 2021, a couple of months ago. I'm really focusing on the third one there, that there is evidence around varying quality, focuses, all kinds of things. But the big issue for many people is, where do you find it? And then the other thing I've put on the bottom of the slide there is that tweet from Rishi Sunak. The evidence says career guidance works, so we'll fund it. Brilliant. National Career Service benefited from that, of course. What would have happened if he'd said career guidance doesn't work, so we won't fund it? Where would we have gone for those quick answers that say, yes, it does? We all know it does, but it's actually, we have to be able to say, here's the evidence, here's the evidence, here's the evidence. So off we rattle. We'll just have an evidence-based repository, no problems. Well, then we start working on the design problems, and I've just done a little sketch here. If we look at the left-hand side here, what we're now thinking about is how we tackle the fact that the evidence has to serve two completely different purposes, although they're of course blended purposes. We need the one that is the kind of hard evidence that we can take to policymakers and funders saying, it works, here's the evidence that it works, we've done the bean counting, we've done this or that, that's why you should fund it. And as an example of that, there is the recent work which was funded by the Careers and Enterprise Company, which looked at the return on investment for personal guidance activities in schools, and taking the higher estimates of the cost of guidance and the lower estimates of the benefits of guidance. It shows that there is at least a £4 return for every £1 invested in career guidance. That's the kind of evidence we need, that we can put in front of people and say, put money in, and the benefits out in terms of people's earning, paying tax, saving on benefits, you know, all those kinds of things. So we must have that kind of hard evidence, but that isn't what practitioners need. Practitioners need this, what works, and it's complicated what works, and it's very, very varied. So our plan at the moment is that we will do this as a stage process. We're going to tackle the hard evidence, the one facing towards policymakers and funders, as the first step, and then we're going to break down the what works exploration, because of course we have very different work contexts, and move on to that later. I mean, what works, for example, we know in relation to pupils at school that experience of the world of work, exposure to employers and to workplaces, is a good thing. We know that there is evidence that that works. It would almost certainly also work for older unemployed people who are very far from the workplace, those who have multiple barriers. But how it would work would be completely different. So we can't say exposure to the workplace works. We've got to go deeper than that and contextualize it, and acknowledge all the variety. We've also, of course, got a couple of questions, one of which, I mean, there are more than two, but just looking at the two I've flagged there, one of which we've covered quite a lot this morning, what constitutes evidence? And I won't talk about that further because that pervades the day. But what we haven't mentioned so much today is, what is success? In whose terms? And certainly just economic success, just wage levels and things like that are absolutely not useful as single measures of success. And I've put that phrase meaningful life, because all of you here will understand what I mean by that. There are plenty of people who will take a lower salary for a better life in whatever way that can be defined for them. And one of the things I was thinking of was some work done a little while ago by the Education and Employers Foundation. As I mentioned before, they looked at the impact of workplace experience, but the single measure that they used was earnings a few years into early career. The more exposure you had to workplaces when you were still at school, the higher your earnings were likely to be later. But that's, you know, there may be people who had had really useful experiences who had decided to go and work for a charity or any kind of field where financial reward was not a major aspect. So we have to really think about not making what would tend to be government assumptions about success, which are just income levels. We must be far more nuanced than that. So just moving on to, oh, my screen will not move forward. Hang on. There we are. So in relation to policymakers and funders, really looking at economic benefits, social benefits. The first point against economic benefits, there's the one I just mentioned about the return on investment. And that report is available on the front end of the CDI website in the reports section there. But there's also an awful lot of economic benefits that are built into our regimes. So there are many things where funding relates to outputs. You're not going to get good outputs from apprenticeships and training schemes and things like that if you haven't got the career guidance into and during those things that make sure that the right people are on the right track to get those outcomes. And of course, higher education has significant employability measures around it. And again, we know that the right people on the right courses at the right time are going to enhance those kinds of outcomes, which are now so important. Social benefits, I've just flagged that you can look at this in kind of two directions. There's the kind of restorative bit of reducing social exclusion, and we tend to focus on that quite a lot when we talk about the sort of whole social justice agenda. But the social benefits also include enhancing social development. It was really interesting to see news reports yesterday of the person who's just leaving the post as the Chief Constable of Merseyside, I think it was, questioned what he would do if he was given £5 billion. He would put £1 billion into law enforcement and policing and £4 billion into tackling social inequality and the kinds of injustices and things that lead to crime. And to my mind, and I'm sure to the mind of almost everybody here, the whole career guidance aspect of getting people into meaningful work would be a part of that £4 billion bid. It was really interesting to hear somebody from that background making that case. But one of the things that he was saying was that people who are in satisfying work, whatever satisfying means to them, will engage in positive ways in their community, as opposed to the negative ones that obviously police get very concerned about. So I think we need to see social benefits again as quite complex and you know, two ways of looking at it. And my question at the bottom is, are these inseparable? Well, they are inseparable, because benefits at individual, income level, family, cohesion, if there are not great stresses from unemployment and lack of money and so on, community level, as I've just covered, and of course the national level. So it's going to be an interesting challenge, and I picked up some useful things today which will help with it, but that's what we're trying to do as the first stage. And then we will start looking at the what works bit in practice and for practitioners. And actually Peter has covered so much of this well already today, but I've put that what works arrow pointing at a blank circle. That circle is a career development intervention. I don't know whether it's an interview, a group session, an experience of work or whatever. The only thing we know is that it is unique. Whatever happens in there will never happen in exactly the same way between exactly the two people again. It is completely unique. So it's looking at all the general trends of all the kinds of things I've put around them, with whom, what context, and so on boxes. And we're going to have to work out how we break down with whom and contexts and outcomes and so on, and break the what works into the kinds of chunks and focuses that are useful to the CDI membership and beyond. So that's our efforts with evidence, and I'm just going to quickly move on to research things. So I think many people here will know that we've had 2 practitioner research conferences in CDI. The last one was in February this year, the first one February a year ago, and that's now annual. Those will keep on going. But what's become very clear from those research conferences is that people have a big appetite for becoming research active, taking research active in the broadest possible sweep, from accessing and using research findings to participating in a supportive way or as a subject, so to speak, within research activity, to conducting it. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Let's go back. Oh no, we don't need that anyway. Sorry, I'm confusing myself. Yes, levels of engagement in research. So I'm just going to run through a couple of things. We are just updating a document that we've had for a while, which is called Accessing Research. And that is available in the members area of the CDI website. And it picks up on a number of things that have been mentioned today, including by Peter, about how you can get hold of research findings, how you can tackle the fact that some of them are behind paywalls, which make it very difficult for you if you don't have a university affiliation. And it concludes with Peter's point of actually talk to the person, write to the person who did the research, published the research. We've also, a small group of 3 of us, mainly led by Michelle Stewart, have developed an action research document, and that's just a little how-to guide that will be published on the CDI's website this month. And probably the most interesting thing is that we now have a 4-session plan for what do I call them? Webinars, discussion groups. The aim is to keep them fairly small and have them highly participative. So a 4-session plan, which will start this June and run through to next March, so roughly 1 a quarter. And our working titles for these 4 sessions are, do you need a research question? That's an interesting one. There are different ways of viewing that. Second one, how to collect evidence. A third one, what shall I do with my data? How do I handle my data now I've got it? And a 4th one, which will be around topics of writing up and disseminating. So it's really a case of watch this space. All those things will obviously be flagged up as they're done. And, oh, now I've lost the slideshow altogether, which I didn't mean to do, because on there was my email address, and also that the message that this is work in progress, and contribution from any member, from anybody who wants to be active within it, is really welcome. I'm done, and they need lunch. And I can't, oh, stop share, there we are.
Yes, indeed. I think people do need lunch, Lynn. So thank you so much. I think it's, you know, if you think of the progress that the CDI has made in this area over the recent past, it's hugely significant, isn't it? So, and obviously a lot more to come. And I can see the complexity of the task, Lynn, that you've got ahead of you.
Yes, I didn't see it before I took it on, though, Rosemary.
Oh no, I can imagine. So you know, good luck with that. So let's draw things to a close for lunch. So I hope it's been a great morning for you. It's certainly been very stimulating. Do share any thoughts in the chat box about that, you know, what you've taken from the morning. We will reconvene at 1:15 for the next session. And this afternoon, we've got two great sessions from Serena Hopkins, which is a 10-year piece of research that she's sharing around practitioner-based research, which I think would be really fascinating, and also from Bob Gilworth on looking at how to use big data sets. So that's going to really be rounding us off. So we look forward to seeing you coming back at 1:15. So enjoy your lunch, get out and get some fresh air, so you're all ready to sparkle this afternoon. Thank you for your attendance, everyone. So welcome back. I think everyone appears to be back, well, as much as we can tell. Maybe say hi in the chat box so we know you're there. We're not talking to blank screens. So hopefully you've been refreshed over lunch. I certainly popped out and took a bit of sunshine in. It's absolutely beautiful outside, isn't it, if you managed to do that. So really pleased with what we've got planned this afternoon. And we've got Serena Hopkins here from Canada. So we're really grateful because Serena has particularly got up early to take part in this. And I think her input's going to be really insightful and I think building on some of the things we talked about this morning, but just so, I think, so interesting in terms of grounding it in day-to-day practitioner work. So I'm going to pass over to Serena now, who's going to lead the next session. So welcome, Serena.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. Thanks for having me. It's lovely to see some familiar names, and when the cameras are on, some familiar faces as well. I'm going to share my screen if I have permission to do so. I'm always so in awe of people who do this seamlessly and just, you know, one click and it's all working perfectly. So I'm going to just ask whether it's now working perfectly. That's, I think, the best I've ever done. Usually I'm scrambling around, so that's great. So this session, I titled it Taking Charge of Our Own Evidence. And, you know, my roots are on the front lines of mental health and careers practice. And as a researcher, I'm really most interested in what can feed and strengthen everyday frontline practice. And at least in Canada, everyday frontline practice, evaluation is something that is very often imposed on us. We are required to track and report certain outcomes. And so our relationship with evaluation and with research broadly is a little bit distanced and not always a happy one. And so I'm really keen in the research that we've been doing to change that equation. So I wanted to start by asking you a little, just to reflect on your relationship with metrics and evaluation. Whether you are working on the front lines, delivering career services, whether you are a researcher or maybe working in policy, whether you think about it much or not. And I would hazard a guess that, you know, the average person doesn't think a whole lot about it, but I'm encouraging you to think about it now. What is your relationship with metrics and evaluation? Is it a red hot burning love affair? Do you just adore working in evaluation? Is it a happy win-win alliance? You know, for example, if you work on the front lines, is data really serving you well? Is it a relationship where you sort of tolerate it, but there's no joy? Or is it more of a resentful relationship, or would you say that it's actually the bane of your existence? In my experience, particularly on the front lines of careers practice, often it's the latter. Often it is as I said earlier, something that is imposed, something that is a requirement, a necessary evil in order to get funding. And the work that we've been doing is really trying to change the nature and the quality of that relationship that we have with metrics and evaluation. So for this session, I'm going to start by just looking at what does evaluation tend to look like on the front lines right now. Where is it headed? Where has it been? Where is it headed? Look at the impact of metrics and evaluation. I mean, we think about evaluation as measuring the impact of something, but in fact, the act of measurement also has an impact. And so I wanted to take a little look at that. And then, as Rosemary said, I'm excited to share the results of the last 10 years of research where we have been really working to change the relationship between frontline practice and evaluation and really integrate seamlessly the role of research and evaluation right into everyday practice. And so share how we did that and what we found when we did it, and hopefully explore a little bit some strategies to strengthen that relationship in different settings, in your settings as well. So when I started working on the front lines in the dark ages, accountability used to be very much based on activity, based on what you did, were you a good steward of the resources that you had? Did you spend the money the way that you were supposed to? Did you deliver the type of activity that you were supposed to? And really the only thing that we reported was how many people showed up. So I was working on the front lines in a service that served dominantly people who were living in extreme poverty and didn't have a home, a permanent address to go to. And this was sort of their place to go during the day. And I quickly learned that if I had good donuts and coffee, people showed up. And so my numbers were great. But nobody actually was really tracking or thinking about too much what benefit or what changed for those folks that showed up. Did it have any impact on them? And as evaluation and accountability evolved, over the years, there has tended to be a much more focus on outcomes. So that question of what changes. It might be changes in awareness or understanding, in behaviors, in skills. But most often, at least in public employment services, the outcomes that actually get tracked and reported tend to be limited to whether a person gets employed or into training. And so in that transition from talking about, how was money spent and how many people showed up, to now talking about outcomes, I think a really important question is who defines those outcomes? Who defines the metrics? And are the results being measured the right results? Are they actually reflective of the important changes that occur by virtue of participating in career and employment services? And who benefits from the collection and reporting of those metrics? Presumably funders benefit, although I would question that. But do we on the front lines benefit from it? Do the people that we serve benefit from the collection of those metrics and the reporting? So I think it's important to think about metrics a little bit more broadly. We think about metrics as a mechanism to evaluate the quality of service. I think that's how often funders think about metrics. They want to have some measure that's going to prove to them whether their investment is actually returning benefits. But in fact, metrics do more than evaluate. They also shape the quality of services. And so when you have limited metrics, it can in fact erode the impact of services. I have on the slide what gets measured gets done. And that is in many ways a simplification, but it is also I think to some extent, a truth. I'm going to give you a very concrete example, and this is certainly very true in Canada, and I'll be interested to know whether it's true in some of your settings as well. In Canada, we have, for the most part, in most jurisdictions, very inadequate metrics are being used, and they are being imposed, and they are very often tied to funding. So, and here I'm talking dominantly about publicly accessible career and employment services offered in communities, dominantly to adults. The funding that those organizations get is often directly tied to the number of people that they get employed or into training. So very limited, inadequate metric, over which they have limited control, right? Whether a person gets employed is not just a reflection of the quality of a service, but very much a reflection of the community in which they live, and the robustness of that labor market, and the constellation of needs that person comes in with. So there's all kinds of factors that influence that metric, but that is the one metric that is used to determine how much funding an organization gets. That incentivizes those working on the front lines to actually move as quickly as they possibly can to getting that person into employment or into training, often skipping what is the absolute linchpin step of quality service, which is understanding what are their strengths and needs. You can't have client-driven, needs-driven services if you don't understand people's needs. And so that step is incentivized to be skipped. And so limited services and interventions, premature referrals to work and training, and inevitably false starts. People are referred to training with unmet pre-employability needs. They are often referred to workplaces that aren't terribly decent and jobs that aren't very sustainable. And so you have this cycle of limited metrics leading to limited interventions, and service delivery leading to false starts and failures, which have enormous costs, not just to the individual, but to the whole ecosystem. And so you have a domino effect of limited metrics really leading directly to a broken ecosystem. And so about 10 years ago, we set out to really try to turn that cycle on its head by taking charge of our own data story. So rather than waiting for the funders to come up with better metrics and better systems to collect data, we thought, what if the front lines take charge of its own data and really try to change that equation? And so we did that really by changing the equation in three big ways. The first was obviously defining more meaningful metrics. And that is easier said than done. That's what took the bulk of the 10 years. But we wanted to get beyond just, is somebody employed or in training, to look at the whole backstory. What happens from the moment a person walks in the door of a service to the point where they exit? What actually changes for them? And what are the changes that actually matter? What are the changes that are predictive of sustainable employment? What are the changes that are predictive of being able to be a lifelong learner and somebody who can manage transitions over the lifespan, so that they're not having to return to services each time they make a change in their life? And so the first step was defining those meaningful metrics. The second way that we wanted to change the equation was to make it really easy for the front lines to collect that data. It is unfortunately a bit of a universal truth, at least in Canada, that our sector hates our case management systems, our reporting systems. Most services are required to enter data and send it off to funders. And it feels like it kind of goes off into the ether, never to be heard or seen from again, seen or heard from again. And it doesn't come back in any meaningful way to the front lines. So the data is not actually feeding frontline service. And And in practice, in very practical terms, people have to find time apart from when they're actually doing the heart of their work, when they're actually working with clients. They have to find time on top of that to go and enter data. And people working on the front lines are there because they want to make a difference. They care about people. And so finding that time often gets put off and put off and put off. And before you know it, you've got a month's worth of data to enter. And so, the integrity of that data is not very good. And then thirdly, we wanted the data to be meaningful, but also accessible to everyone in the system. So not just the funder or the policymaker. We actually wanted the data to be feeding back directly to the front lines. So we wanted data to come in a form that was actually meaningful to the client themselves, that they could use in their own career planning. We wanted data that would be meaningful for the frontline practitioner, where they could start to see patterns in their own practice, what was working, what wasn't working, how were their clients changing. When they worked with a client with a particular need, were they having more impact as opposed to when they were working with clients with different needs? So data that would actually feed and inform their practice, and of course, could feed and inform managers and community networks of services. So data for all, not just for those that were making policy and funding decisions. And so we started out, it's over 10 years ago now, by asking a simple question. And we asked it to the front lines: what actually changes? What changes do you hope will occur? So for those receiving services, what changes do you really want to have happen? And once you've gone through career services, reflecting back, what were the changes that really mattered? What were the changes that really moved you and changed and transformed you in a way that made you more able to manage your career, more able to achieve your goals? What were the changes that mattered? And similarly to the front lines, what changes do you see in clients that are important but never get tracked or reported? So yes, every day, or you are expected to enter how many people get employed or in training, but what are all the other changes that you see that matter? And those that work on the front lines, you see those, you see changes every day. You see people transforming in front of your eyes. So what are those changes? And that's where we started. And what we translated those into form 6 sort of categories of changes. And this is built on a model that has been around in Canada for a very long time, the Employability Dimensions. And these dimensions try to explain the sort of categories of change that occur in people's lives as they move through career and employment services. And they loosely often follow kind of it is certainly not linear, but a little bit of a developmental flow that people often will go through as they work through employability issues. So just to make it very concrete, sometimes people come to us as career service provider with pre-employability needs. So issues that really make it difficult for them to substantively focus on careers issues. They may be very practical issues, like they have no way to get to work or school in terms of transportation. They may not be in safe housing. They may have unaddressed mental health or physical health challenges or addictions challenges, or there may be more of a attitudinal lack of readiness, that they don't actually believe in a future for themselves, and so there may be motivational issues. People may have that kind of readiness, but they really don't know the direction they want to move in. They may be lacking in self-awareness, really having a sense of who they are and what's important to them. They may have a lack of labor market awareness, very unaware of the range of opportunities that are out there in the labor market. They may know the direction they want to go in, but not have the skills or credentials to get there. And so our work may be focused on helping them to build their skills or to attain a credential that is needed to enter the area of work that they want. Work search and entrepreneurship. Work search is sort of what people looking at our field from the outside think we do every day. They think we help get people jobs. And certainly that's a part of what we do, but it is a part within a broader context. If people are not ready to move into that work, part of our work is helping them to get ready. And of course, employment maintenance. Sometimes people are great at getting jobs, but can't keep one to save their lives. And so sometimes our work is helping them with that. But then a final category really emerged in our research, and we very creatively called that other influencers. And it is really focused much more around intrapersonal factors. So issues like, I mentioned earlier, does the person actually feel a sense of hope when they think about their future? Peter talked a lot about self-efficacy. That's very much part of the other influencers. Resilience, the capacity to bounce back, openness to change. And so what you see below each of those categories are some of the indicators, the actual indicators of change under each of those categories that we spent our 10 years really with the front lines trying to articulate. And that other influencer category really rose to the top as very strongly predictive of long-term success and sustainable success in learning and work. So from the articulation of sort of indicators under each of these employability dimensions, we set out to build a tool or an approach, more aptly described, I would say, as an approach, to actually integrate the collection of that data, data around those indicators in day-to-day frontline practice. And what emerged is a tool called Prime. And at its heart, it really is an elegantly simple employability assessment approach. And so we train people to conduct a really rigorous and robust employability assessment. And, you know, if you work on the front lines, the way that we train that is probably going to be very familiar to you. It's about helping people to tell their story and pulling out that story and exploring the story deeply to really get at the full constellation of what are their employability strengths and what are their employability needs. And Prime is simply an online tool, that a place where you can capture that data in a series of snapshots. And so the idea is to get a snapshot of the person's employability strengths and needs when they walk in the door at intake, and then to update that snapshot as they move through services, so that over time you begin to, behind the curtain of Prime in its database, get a really robust data picture of all of the subtle ways in which that person is changing. And it's done with the person. So it really is integrated directly into practice and then feeds practice, because the needs that are the highest priority are the ones that trigger what are the kinds of interventions that you're going to deliver, what are the kinds of goals that are going to emerge for that person, what are the action plans that really make sense for them given the strengths that they have and the foundation of strength that they're building on and the priority needs that they have. So this is just a screenshot of an example of Prime. You'll see that it has the indicators under each of the employability dimensions, and the screen obviously goes on with the other 4 dimensions. And what happens when, so just, I'll give you an example. In practice, you would have a conversation with the person. You might pause at a natural point and say, let's just see if we really have a shared understanding of where you are with respect to what you've just been telling me. And there's an opportunity to actually, on a scale of 1 to 5, say whether that particular indicator is an area of great strength, which would show up as a green. Is it an area where you're sort of working on it? It might be yellow, might be orange if it's a bit of a challenge, and it might be red if it's a really significant priority need. And so what you have immediately is a visual representation, which is of course great if there's literacy issues around where's the foundation of strength, which is incredibly rare. Unfortunately, in our services, we tend to jump right to problems and not acknowledge the strengths that people walk through the door with. And so it's really important to show that strength. But we also see the fertile ground, the red and the orange, where it's naturally leading us as a practitioner to say, this might be an area where we want to spend some time. And because it's done collaboratively, it really is also a mechanism to engage that person in their own story and in their own in building their own future. I think it's important to say that Prime is not meant to be an absolute measure of any of these things. It's meant to instead measure change. And so it matters less whether a 5 is a 5 is a 5, whether it is the same, whether 5 is the same for every person. What matters is that moving from a 4 to a 5 is the same. So it's trying to capture that change that occurs in people, rather than create an absolute measure. So, and it is not a checklist. So let me just reinforce again, it's not about going line by line and checking off. It is about conducting a really rigorous employability assessment through storytelling, but then using Prime as a place to actually record and reach consensus with your client and really delve in and ensure that there's a shared understanding as a platform, as a basis for moving forward with service delivery. And so you'll see I captured another screen. This might be what it would look like the second time around when we meet. The last assessment would come up and we can start by saying, so what's changed since we last met? And there's an opportunity to tweak and adjust that snapshot, save that, and so you end up with a whole series of snapshots. So with Prime, it's used as part of everyday service, but we've also continued to do research with Prime. And our most recent research was conducted between 2018 and 2020 in an eastern region of Canada with 6 agencies that were working with very diverse clients in the community. So we had men recently released from prison. We had single moms who had been living in extreme poverty. We had refugees that had just come to Canada recently. We had young people who were out of school, out of work. And we had other people that I can't remember right now. So 6 agencies. We had a little over 1,000 clients who engaged in the research. And so this was we were not asking people to change how they deliver service in any way. We trained them, other than we trained them how to do a really good, solid employability assessment, and asked them to use Prime as a tool in their practice. And so they did so for 14 months, and we tracked both the data, obviously, that they collected and analyzed that. And we also tracked the impact of them working in this way on them and their own practice. And so I'm keen to share those results with you now. So this slide shows you where the focus was in the initial conversation. So what were the issues that clients were most wanting to talk about when they first came for service, which of course is an interesting indication of where the biggest needs are. And it's fascinating to me that the extent of need that focused around pre-employability and sort of that career exploration or career decision-making. I mean, it's certainly work search is still a significant area of need, at 88%. But, you know, I would say that almost all of our services in Canada are dominantly focused on work search. And we have actually very few services that are explicitly focused on pre-employability and career exploration. And so having this data to show that there's actually enormous need in that area, and we don't necessarily have services aligned to those needs, is in and of itself a really interesting piece of data. And likewise, those other employability influencers, those issues around hope and resilience and motivation and self-efficacy, also big need there. And again, is that part of our explicit thinking as we plan services and as we fund services? So that's at the dimension level, so high level. When we drill down to look at actual indicators, again, some really interesting pictures emerge. In Canada, transportation is an enormous issue, and it sounds mundane, and you think somebody else surely can take care of that, but nobody else does take care of that. And so if our career services don't think about whether people can actually get to school or work and don't help them address that, they are going to spin. So sometimes the issues that prevent people from moving forward are very practical ones, but sometimes they are also very important deep ones around self-awareness, labor market awareness, and some of those intrapersonal factors. You know, so that sense of self-efficacy, hopefulness, and openness are 3 of the top 5 issues that people came wanting help with. And so what emerged from that part of the research was, for the first time ever, and this astounds me, I hope it's different in your settings, but in most jurisdictions in Canada, we had no data on people's actual needs when they came in. What were their strengths and needs? We had no data on that. And so now for the first time, we have a picture of what are the strengths that people bring when they come into services, and what are the needs? What are their dominant needs? What are they most wanting help to change? We also, of course, were really interested in how people changed. And so the heart of this research in many ways was really understanding, how do people change by virtue of receiving career and employment services? What are the actual ways in which people transform and change? And so that's the data that I want to present to you now. Again, I'm going to start at a high level at the employability dimensions level. And I mean, the short Reader's Digest version of this is that they change in important fundamental ways, positive ways across all dimensions. So we had statistically significant positive changes across every single dimension. So people became more employment ready. They became clearer about themselves and labor market opportunities. They became more skillful. They became more capable of conducting work search or creating work. They became more capable of maintaining work in a sustainable way. And importantly, they became stronger in terms of those intrapersonal factors like resilience and hope and self-efficacy and openness to change. And so just to give you a sense of the magnitude of change, on average, there was a 0.4 change, which doesn't sound like a lot, but what it translates into is that half of the people served moved an entire point on that 5-point scale. So what the data analysts and researchers tell me is that is not only statistically significant change, but it's also clinically significant. Like it actually is change that matters. It's change that means that a person has moved from not at all okay to a little bit okay, or from a little bit okay to really okay. And so the next few slides drill down into that data a little bit, and I'm going to move fairly quickly through these because the story is the same across the board for the most part. What we see, so when we drill into, for example, the pre-employability or job readiness dimension, We had 9 unique variables that, or indicators, that we were assessing in underneath pre-employability. We saw statistically significant positive progress across all 9. The largest increases were around access to needed services, so access to addiction services, mental health services, dependent care. But we have significant change all the way down those 9 variables, which is really exciting, given that, you know, as I said earlier, many of our services don't actually on the surface explicitly sort of advertise that they're delivering pre-employability services. They often are advertised as work search services. And so I think, you know, certainly funders and probably even the public have little awareness that this expertise actually exists and these services are having that impact. When we move to career exploration or decision-making, very similar story. We had 7 unique indicators that we were measuring there, statistically significant positive changes across all of them. The largest increases were really around understanding the labor market, understanding the conditions of the labor market, and the kinds of expectations that existed in the range of opportunities that were out there, and how to connect labor market opportunity with what mattered to the individual, with their own self-awareness. If we move to skills enhancement, again, statistically significant positive change across all 3 indicators that we had there. The largest change was around having strategies to address that have both anticipated and unanticipated challenges in learning. Work search and entrepreneurship. And here was an interesting one, that the only incident of negative progress. So we had statistically significant progress across 8 of the 9 variables. The only area where we saw actual regression was for entrepreneurs having a realistic business plan. And so there's several possible ways to make sense of that. One is that those that work in public career and employment services don't have a lot of training around how to work with clients who are wanting to pursue entrepreneurship. Or on the positive slant, it may be that people come with unrealistic plans, but the person, when they work with a career practitioner, they may be actually seeing for the first time that their plan isn't realistic. And so it may be more positive than we think it is. So the largest increases in this area really were around having specific strategies and tools to navigate in the labor market, and understanding workplace norms and expectations. Same story with work maintenance. We had 4 variables there, all statistically significant positive changes. And then importantly, those other employability influencers, the capacity to bounce back was the largest. So resilience was the largest positive impact, but the capacity to follow through on commitment, openness to new ideas, feeling hopeful, and that sense of self-efficacy that Peter talked about. So the interesting thing when you have data beyond whether a person gets employed or in training is that you can slice and dice the data in different ways to tell different stories. And we were interested in the story of the impact of career services on mental health. And here, let me be clear, when you think about that continuum of mental health, we're all on a continuum of mental health. Any given day, any given moment, we are somewhere on that continuum, some days better than others. And we've been working with Dr. Dave Redikoff and Mike Houston here in Canada, who just published a book on the impact of career development on mental health. And they had done a deep dive analysis on sort of what are the factors that contribute to where you are on that continuum. So I'm not talking about a diagnosed mental illness. I'm really talking about that continuum where we all are moving at one point or another. And what they found were that these these factors that are on the screen are the ones that really underpin where we are on any given day in terms of that mental health continuum. And so we did a mapping of the indicators in PRIME against those factors. And we found that there were actually 16 indicators in PRIME that were aligned across the factors identified by Redekop and Houston. And so we did an analysis of progress, or how people changed against those 16 indicators. And again, what we found was positive, statistically significant positive change across all of the indicators, with again, the largest changes, which was consistent with that pre-employability dimension. Largest changes were around actually accessing needed services and finding stability around mental health issues or addictions issues, but also a very strong positive change around motivation. So, you know, I think what we came away from this last round of research, but really the culmination of the 10 years, was the extent to which, when we are in control of what gets measured and how it's measured, data becomes power. You know, for the first time ever, we were able to tell the client, the real client story, like what really happens in service beyond whether a person gets employed or in training. So we have data on what are the strengths that people come with, what are the foundations that people are building onto when they come for services. What are the needs that they come with? What are they hoping will change? What's giving them the most angst? What are they most stuck with? What are the dominant focus of, what's the dominant focus of service delivery? And does it in fact align with people's needs? Are we delivering the services that people most need and want? You know, having that data on how clients progress, where do they get stuck? Where are they not progressing? And where are they progressing most quickly? And, you know, Lynn talked about that, you know, being able to link intervention with impact, and the power of being able to see those patterns. When I do X with somebody who's struggling with this need, it really works. They soar. When I do Y, they spin. And having that kind of data to feed day-to-day practice is so powerful. And so, as I said at the beginning, what we were really trying to do is both feed practice and strengthen and inform quality practice, and end up with a much more compelling story to tell the funders as well. So both and. And so what we end with is this compelling tale of client transformation, the meaningful and cost-saving ways that people change. When people become grounded and stable and hopeful, they are much more likely to be able to see a future and believe in a future and want to invest in a future. They are much more likely to be able to navigate the world of learning and to get the skills and credentials that they need. They're much more likely to be able to effectively navigate the labor market, to find or create work, and to use their strengths to thrive in their career, to have outcomes that are sustainable. You know, and so PRIME is both collecting all of that backstory and scratching the surface around those blunt outcomes of employment or training. So we don't just ask whether they're employed or in training. We ask about the likely sustainability of that work or learning. Is it in their community? Is it does it keep them above the poverty line? Is it a decent workplace? And so really trying to get a much more robust picture. And, you know, unlike most of the data collection tools that have been out there, you know, the frontlines don't despise it, which is an added bonus. That's the feedback that we got from the people that are using it, is that it really does seamlessly integrate into practice, and it feels like it is not just for the purpose of collecting data, but also for the purpose of informing and enhancing everyday practice in the moment. And so, you know, and because it provides a little bit of a structure and sort of a frame for practice, it can increase focus and actually, at the end of the day, save time. And so, you know, I think as we move forward with this research, and we hope to continue to, even as organizations are using Prime just as part of their day-to-day practice outside of a specific research project. I mean, I think our goal is that every organization would be a research organization at the same time. You know, when we start to integrate research directly into practice, not only do we start to get much bigger data sets, but we start to have that incremental benefit of having data feed practice and inform everybody in the ecosystem. And what we're really excited about is, even with this most recent research, we did see predictive relationships. So when people make meaningful changes at that pre-employability phase, for example, we're starting to see how that is predictive of them actually getting clear, predictive of them becoming more skilled, predictive of them being able to sustain meaningful work in their life. And that's when we can start to tell different stories to our funders, when we can say with clarity and with data to back us up that some of that work that doesn't get tracked, doesn't get reported, and doesn't get acknowledged is actually directly feeding the capacity of our field to achieve those ultimate outcomes that the funder is so interested in. And I said earlier that we tracked both the impact of services on the client, but we were also really interested in what's the impact when a practitioner also becomes a researcher in their day-to-day practice. What is the impact of using a tool and an approach that actually gives them data all the time that can inform their practice? And what we found is that it changed a lot. We collected data from participating practitioners before they started using Prime and participating in this research, and then collected it at the end. And what we found were, again, both statistically and clinically significant positive changes around their sense of professionalism, their professional identity, their sense that they were professionals that had clear impact. They were much more interested in professional development, much more interested in certification, much more interested in being connected to the national and international community of practice, much more interested in attending events like this, more committed to and felt more capable of ethical practice. So much more in tune with their own ethical code and more active in collaborating with colleagues around ethical decision-making when it came to their practice. Their reporting around client engagement was that clients were much more engaged in their day-to-day practice, that they felt like they weren't sort of doing to their clients, but rather working with their clients, and that clients were more actively engaged in their own goal setting and in their own action planning. They reported feeling that their services were much enhanced from a quality perspective. And of course, we would have been a bit sad if this wasn't the case. They really felt that they were truly embracing evidence-based practice, and that they were living it, that day-to-day evidence-based practice was who they were and what they did. And so this really speaks to a tale of sort of client transformation, practitioner transformation, but it also speaks to the art of the possible around systemic transformation. And so if you recall, I showed that picture that looked a lot like this of the domino effect when you start with limited metrics, and how that really can trigger and incentivize a system that breaks itself in many ways. And what we're trying to do is really turn that on its head and start with really strong metrics that are trying to tell the full data story, and which then triggers and incentivizes the field to really deeply understand people's strengths and needs, and do that robust, fulsome employability assessment, which is the underpinning for knowing how to proceed with practice. If you don't know people's strengths and needs, it's very difficult, I think, to be anything but program driven, rather than need and strength driven. And so taking the time to do that strong employability assessment directly feeds good interventions. As if when you understand what people's strengths are and you really deeply understand the needs that they're wanting to resolve, your interventions can be targeted toward that directly, which inevitably feeds much stronger outcomes, including sustainable employment and training, and really feeds a much stronger ecosystem that is informed day by day by evidence and data, and fueled by professionals, and really is intended to complete the circle of strong metrics leading to a strong ecosystem. Rosemary, you look like you want to ask something.
Serena, we're a little bit running out of time, but I was so loath to disrupt you. And we've got a couple of questions. So if you just could I don't know how much more you want to say. And then
I have hardly any.
That's
all
good
I have is to come back to this question. And my closing remark was that I really encourage you to think about your relationship with metrics and evaluation, and to take charge of that data story. And Prime is one tool. I think there's many ways that we can do that. But I think that doing so not only will make your funders happy, but it also is a mechanism for really promoting quality in day-to-day practice. So, and that's all I had left. So
sorry to just cut you in there. That honestly, Serena, that was absolutely brilliant. I think there's been so many comments in the chat box that you haven't seen, people responding to it and just finding it really interesting. I think that point you were making at the end about how practitioners relate to this is so powerful as well. It giving confidence, and I guess feeling you're making a difference, and knowing that your methods are working, and all of those benefits that you get from applying this. But we did have a couple of questions. One was from Liam, which was about what's the relationship between Prime and the blueprint you have for careers in Canada? Has it superseded it? Is it linked? So whether you could tell us about that.
The blueprint for life work designs. Oh my goodness, I haven't. We haven't talked about the blueprint in a long time. So Prime is really, it's a very good question. So I would say that there are many similarities. I think that you could quite readily map the two onto one another. What I think Prime is trying to do is take the blueprint and put it into language that makes sense in frontline day-to-day practice. And so put it in the language that that clients might use when they're coming and saying, what I really need help with is X. We were really trying to put it in that kind of language so that we could track that progress and really integrate it directly into practice. But it's actually a very astute observation that there would be a direct linkage. Absolutely.
Super, thank you. Just one quick question as well, which was about the link between career development and mental health, which you talked about. And I'm interested in this as well, because a lot of organizations invest in mental health and well-being, and they don't necessarily invest in careers. So the question is about, are you saying that there is a strong causal link between mental health and career development services?
In short, yes. I worked in mental health before I came into the careers field explicitly. I worked in mental health for many years. And I think what attracted me to the careers field was that I saw every day in my work that when people could meaningfully connect somehow with community, whether it was through paid or unpaid work, whether it was through formal or informal learning, it absolutely had a direct and significant impact on their mental health. I didn't have the data at the time to show it, but I saw it every day in my mental health practice. And I always felt that the role of careers was really underexplored and underused in the mental health field. And so, yes, in short, I mean, the data that we've collected here would suggest absolutely yes. And I think there's more work to be done on that front. And I think it's really timely for our field to be able to demonstrate. I think the more we can show the full impact of career and employment services, the better, both in terms of stabilizing and securing our funding, but also in terms of building awareness of the breadth of careers work.
Well, thank you so much, Serena. You might want to look in the chat box, and there's maybe a few more questions coming in there, but I'm really conscious we've got another input to come. So I think it might be good to just, again, stand up a bit, maybe just, have a bit of a stretch before we start again, move about, just do something that, gives you a bit of a look out the window if you're sitting by a window, and just have that slight transition to the next session. So I don't know if any of you are doing that, but it helps me anyway. So I'm now delighted to introduce Bob Gilworth, who's going to talk about, and I've heard Bob talk about this before. It's very fascinating, using big data sets and how that can impact our work. So I'm going to pass to Bob now, who's going to take us through a bit of a story. And after that, we will have another breakout session before we have a short bit at the end of the day to sort of wrap everything up. So welcome.
Thanks, Rosemary. Hello, everybody. Can I just check, can you see the slides? Because I have shared them. Yeah, so I just need to go to slideshow.
That's perfect, yeah.
Okay. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk about large data sets, and I'm going to talk in particular about a specific large data set that is often known as careers registration, and I'll say a little bit more about variations on that theme in a moment. So there are a couple of, in a nutshell, descriptions of what careers registration is. One from me, which links to a blog piece from our research group at Huddersfield, so you can follow that link if you like, and there's more stuff behind that. But essentially, it's widely adopted. It's about understanding career development starting points and journeys, and that's the key. And there's another in a nutshell description there from another NICEC fellow, namely David Winter, from his chapter in the Graduate Careers in Context book. And David talks about an opportunity to gain evidence-based insight into the career development needs of current students and to prioritize and target support accordingly, and that's absolutely key. So a couple of what I hope are useful brief descriptions of what I'm going to talk about. I've used the term careers registration. If you hear people in UK higher education talk about this, and this at the moment is very much a higher education thing, then you'll hear it very often referred to as career readiness data, and I think that's fair, because that's a reasonable description of what the data is. I often use the term careers registration because I was there at the start of it, and careers registration is actually the mechanism for obtaining the data. So I'm going to talk about how it came about, why it came about, how it works, show you some examples of the data and its strategic use, stressing the point that data is not an end in itself. Talk about limitations, because any approach has limitations, and ways in which that might be mitigated. A few thoughts on where this is going in the future and how it has changed the conversation within higher education in this country. And I think it's important to just mention at the beginning that this data is not public data. This is data that comes from within institutions. So to take Serena's point about taking charge, this is internal data for doing the job. it can actually be combined between institutions through agreed protocols, and that has happened through a large-scale research project that I'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of how it all began and why this came about, I just need to take you right back to the University of Leeds in the academic year 2011-12. And the context is the development of an institutional employability strategy and our realization that we were staring into a yawning data gap. And we realized that what we needed was the key information that many of us who worked for many years, as I did, or still do, in careers and employability in higher education, we needed the key information that we bumbled along without for just about as long as anybody could remember. And apologies to the small number of you who have heard me use this example many times before, but it's the best way, I think, to explain it, which is, if you can imagine, if we're thinking about career development as a journey, if you can imagine that at some point in the not too distant future, we will return to our offices and our campuses, etc. And imagine you're in your office and someone's coming to visit you, and they've never been to your office before. They pitch up somewhere in the city that you are based in, and then they call you and they ask you for directions. What is the absolute number one key piece of information that you must obtain from that person in order to help to give them directions to get to where they need to be? And the answer to that, of course, is, where are you now? So we had lots of information about what had happened to previous students from destination data. What we didn't have was the data that we really needed. Not that the destination data isn't useful, it is useful, but we needed data on starting points and journeys. We needed the answer to that question, where are you now? So yes, the destination data is very useful, but what we needed was information on starting points and journeys for current students, as well as information on what had happened to past students. Now, before I go on to describe the mechanics of this in a bit more detail, I just want to make a couple of more sort of philosophical points about careers and employability, if you like. So the notion of employability, and what do we mean by employability? So I'll just share this definition with you here. The lifelong capability to make well-informed, realistic plans for the future and to be ready, willing, and able to execute these in a changing world. So the real key point that I want to get across there is that the idea that what we're talking about is a capability, not necessarily an outcome, which is the main measures that we had. And also about the idea of careers and employability. And I think it's useful to just mention the context at the time, and it hasn't been true for a while, but particularly around about that time, so much noise around higher education about employability in really quite abstract terms, and a sense in which the notion of career was potentially being drowned out, and the possibility of the idea of career, if you like, the career baby being thrown out with the employability bathwater. So it was important for a number of us, I felt, to make the point that when career services in higher education are going around changing their names to careers and employability services, which has been a frequent occurrence, and it's not something I'm arguing against, I think it's important that we understand that the latter is not just a more modern way of saying the former. What we're saying is that employability, if you like, we're understanding that as the relatively linear acquisition of the luggage. So the analogy is the luggage in the map. That it's the relatively linear acquisition of assets, capital, employability capital, if you like, experience, knowledge, skills, connections. And whereas career is the personal, iterative definition of purpose and direction. So the map, if you like, the luggage in the map. So the personal career context is the thing that translates the acquisition of assets into meaningful outcomes for students, employers, and society. So I just want to mention that, because when we use the shorthand employability, and I'm talking about employability strategy in the context that I'm going to describe, I just want to be clear that we mean careers and employability. and the sense that an institution that's devising a strategy that only does one or the other is only doing half the job. And that also relates to the way in which we wanted to understand and fill that data gap, i.e. to cover both sides of this equation, not just one of them. So we had, at the University of Leeds, we were developing and implementing a strategy for employability, a capability, as I've described it. But the only large-scale data set that we had was, as it was then, the Destinations of Leavers from Higher Education survey, the Delhi survey, which had a very high response rate, 80%. But it measured an outcome at a particular time, 6 months after graduation, as it was then, 15 months now with the new Graduate Outcomes Survey. So it measured an outcome or possibly a staging post, but it didn't measure the capability that we were trying to understand whether we were developing that or not. The essence of the strategy that we were developing was the idea that we would try to help all of our students to decide on the options to pursue, to plan, to acquire the right skills, experiences and networks, and to compete effectively in their chosen fields. And that was the essence of our strategy. That was the way in which our strategy was communicated across the institution to help people to buy into it. When we talk about careers registration as it's evolved over the last number of years, I think quite a lot of people think that the decide, plan and categories, plan and compete categories came out of the process of careers registration. They didn't. They came from the strategy, which came first. But essentially, what we needed was a data set which would help us to understand starting points and journeys in the context that I've just described of deciding, planning and competing. What about the luggage then, if that previous bit was the map? Well, part of that acquisition of assets, one of the things we were most interested in was the acquisition of work experience. Market messages come back from the graduate market time and time again, which very crudely say something like no work experience, no graduate job. That's oversimplifying, but if you look at the High Flyers survey, for example, every year, there's a message in there that says something along these lines, not as crudely. We also know that work experience is a key contributor to commercial awareness, which certainly at the time we were doing this was a major issue in graduate recruitment, and that in itself is closely linked to career motivation. And quite often at the time, the two things were being cited together as the main cause of where failure happened in graduate recruitment processes. So one way and another, and others have said this earlier, the notion that the acquisition of work experience is a good thing. But as an institution, a university with 31,000 students, we have to ask ourselves, but how much do we actually know about our students' acquisition of work experience? And I think the honest hand-on-heart answer to that is, we know about those bits which the university takes a direct hand in. So those bits that might be, say, a sandwich placement year in a degree program, because that's in the student record. Other things might be in a student record, or things that are managed by the university in another way, say that they are internship schemes managed by the careers service. But beyond that, there's a whole swathe of work experience that students engage in that we had no systematic way of understanding. And the best way to understand that is to ask the students. So what we needed was data that we'd never had before. And we needed a comprehensive data set that would show starting points and progress, that it would be standardized information capture that would cover all students, and all students is the key here, because one of the key issues, criticisms, if you like, that sometimes can be leveled at higher education career service, or has been in the past, is that it's very easy to fall into the trap of constantly engaging and re-engaging with the engaged minority of students, polishing the silver, as one of my colleagues at the University of London used to call it, and not necessarily understanding what's going on with all students, particularly those that don't necessarily engage with the careers service. So that was really important. It needed to be a longer useful timeline, which essentially is the degree program. And as Jane referred to earlier, to enable both cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis. So to see how cohorts are doing really in relation to each other, or how a single cohort might progress over time. And we racked our brains to think about how can we do this at scale in the way that we needed to. And there's only one viable option. We thought of others, none of them would work, or none of them would be comprehensive. The only viable way to do this was through registration, or if you like, the formal enrollment process. That's the only way that this was ever going to work. So what that meant was that we needed to convince the university of the value of embedding careers and employability data capture into one of its most fundamental and closely guarded business processes. And this meant engaging with colleagues in registry who would get, on an almost daily basis, requests from people to include things in the registration process. And the stock reply would be no, for perfectly understandable reasons, because they didn't want to deflect students from completing their enrollment. So this is a story of something that, as you'll see, is technically simple, but politically challenging. And I wouldn't want to underestimate the scale of that political challenge, but just give you the good news that we managed to overcome it, and we got the backing we needed, and it happened. But without the backing of senior leadership who got the point, and colleagues in registry and IT who were prepared to go along with it, this would never have happened. It needed to be linked to the main student record system, which would enable careers and employability data to be linked to other data. And of course, through the enrollment system, that ensures that takes place. And that's really important. So to give you an idea of how this works then, and if you want a bit more detail on this, then have a look at the blog piece that I quoted earlier, or David's chapter that I quoted earlier. There's some quite detailed stuff about how this works. But essentially, a student goes to do their online enrollment, and this is every student, every level, every year. So a student may be coming to the university for the first time as a new student, and then every time they re-enroll as a returning student, the same thing happens. So in the enrollment process, there is a form that's been added into the process, and it presents them with 10 common sense statements about career thinking that range from this is pretty well not on my radar at one end, through to I've got some tentative ideas, or I've got some ideas and I'm ready to kind of explore, make connections, get some work experience, through to I'm ready to apply, or even I'm applying and not getting very far, right through to actually I've got it all sorted, thanks very much. And behind the scenes, those statements are divided into those categories, but that wasn't the way they're presented, or isn't the way they're presented to students. They're just presented to students as 10 common sense statements. Pick the one that most closely reflects your current situation as you see it. Now, because we had time at Leeds, because we'd thought about this a lot, we took a holistic approach to this, which meant that not only did we redevelop our website to fit in with it, but we also enabled automated responses to students when they submitted their enrollment. So the student got a response straight away, which said, we see you said this, here is how to develop your ideas and plans further from the point that you're starting from, reinforcing the point that your starting point is okay, and how we might help you to do that. And usually to link that to appropriate resources. Now, I'm a great believer in that. I think there's a sense of equity. The student puts something in, the student gets something back. And also critically, it combines data gathering with student engagement. So I think those are really important, but I do understand that some institutions, whilst they've been able to do the data gathering part, they haven't necessarily been able to do the automated responses bit because they were two slightly separate jobs. So not all institutions have been able to do this, but a number have. We certainly did at the beginning. This is from the University of Ulster, who I think have done a very good job in doing this. So you can see the sort of responses that students at the University of Ulster will get. And you can see that they're positive, encouraging statements that are basically saying, we're meeting you where you're starting from, and here is how we can help you from here. So I do think that's an important part of it where that can be done. So that's the first part. That's the map bit. That's the first bit of careers registration. And then the second part, the luggage bit, if you like. So there's a second form that sits in the enrollment process. And when the student gets to that bit, they're asked to indicate their acquisition of work experience and their participation in other employability enhancing activities, usually within a time frame. Which of these things have you done in the last 12 months? But in this case, rather than just ticking the one that most closely reflects their situation, because they could have done many of them, they tick as many as apply. So we have both sections. They're there in the enrollment process. They're a compulsory part of the enrollment process before the submit button, and then off we go. So having piloted it in a limited way, we went live in 2012. And when it was first run at the University of Leeds, then we got 31,000 plus responses. In other words, everybody. Between when registration opened on the 1st of August 2012 and when it closed on the 31st of October 2012. So in effect, we went from no data to big data at a timescale that by higher education standards is pretty well overnight. Now, in using the use of the data in any given institution at any given time, the focus is usually on current students. Understandably, that was the point of doing it. But in longitudinal terms, you can get an idea of the scale of the data set as it builds up by simply taking the number of years that an institution has been doing this and multiplying it by the size of their student cohort. So if you take University of Leeds, for example, 9 years times 31,000, roughly 280,000 would be the size of the overall data set for the University of Leeds. So I'm going to show you some output now. So this next slide is going to show the distribution of undergraduate students at the start of their final year of an undergraduate degree across the 3 headline categories of deciding, planning, and competing. The example I'm going to show you comes from a faculty. So at that time, the University of Leeds had 9 faculties, which are groups of schools, groups of cognate schools. This is from one of them. So it's the headline figures for the faculty as a whole. And I chose this example because its numbers are pretty close to the average for the university as a whole. So before I show you this, I'd quite like you to just pause for a moment and just think in your mind's eye, what do you think that pie chart might look like? So this pie chart is going to show how final year students in a given faculty are distributed by self-report in terms of where they see themselves in deciding, planning, or competing. How do you think those will be made up? What proportions do you think will be in each category? So just have a think about that for a moment, and then I'll show you the slide and see whether it accords with what thought you had. So here we go. So this is how the data came through. So as you can see, almost half of the students at the beginning of their final year are in the decide phase. Now, of course, the decide part covers, from not on my radar through to I've got some ideas, 1 or 2 ideas, and I'm ready to start taking some action. Around about just over a quarter in the plan phase, about a fifth in the compete phase. Other is essentially the sorted. I've got it all sorted. Thanks very much. So, in terms of the impact of this data, bearing in mind nobody had ever seen it before, we'd never had this data before, I think it's useful to just reflect on what that impact was. So what it did was it gave us an evidence-based conversation between the career centre and faculties that wasn't based on an external metric, and it wasn't based on something that was about people who left a year ago, which when we discussed that before quite often just went like this. This was about students who are here right now. It was data for action. It was explaining a situation that you could do something about. And I cannot overemphasize how important that was and how big an impact that was to go from the abstract consideration of destination data to the real-time consideration of the situation as reflected by students who are here right now. One of the things that the data has been very powerful in doing is tackling misplaced assumptions. So everybody on this session, I'm sure, will be familiar with the idea, and Serena referred to it, the idea that careers is all about CVs and applications. And wouldn't that be even more so for final year students? Really? Well, when only 1/5 of final year students are in the compete or are reporting themselves as ready to compete, maybe that isn't the most beneficial use of scarce resources in this particular faculty. Maybe we need to think about that. As I said, those are headline figures and there are nuances within those categories. So we had a good example there of history and classics, where two subject areas that in many ways are similar. Their intake profile was almost identical, but their graduate outcomes data was very different. And when we looked at it, we could see also that their proportion of final year students in the decide phase overall was also quite similar. What was different was that in the school that had the better graduate outcomes, far more of their students who were in the decide phase were at the got a few ideas and ready to take action end of the decide phase. And for the one with the lower graduate outcomes, far more of their students were at the more or less not on my radar end of the decide phase. So that was a very interesting way of seeing the nuances within headline categories. And it's also interesting to be able to combine that with things like engagement data. And you might not be surprised to know that the school with the lower graduate outcomes also had lower career service engagement data. This, I think it's fair to say, provided significant addition to the expertise position of careers professionals. And bear in mind, in higher education, quite some time ago now, in many cases, we changed the title from careers advisor to careers consultant. And who are they primarily consultants to? Academic departments, where evidence is king. Clearly, as just to use the example about compete and CVs that I used a second ago, about directing scarce resources to where they'll genuinely make the most difference, and about reaching beyond the engaged minority. So this was the second part of careers registration data for the same faculty. And you can see there that the headline figure that would have grabbed attention was the one that said, well, when we were presented with all these different ways in which I could have got some work experience, I'm still going to tick the box that says I've got no work experience at all, 93, at the beginning of the final year. And the way that we dealt with that, and many other institutions do this, is the data feeds into the personal tutor dashboard. The personal tutor, who is dealing with 1s and 2s, not 93, can see this issue, flag it up with the student. They're not being asked to solve it. They're being asked to signpost them to where they might get some help with that. So that's where we got to. By the ADCAS conference in 2013, we knew this was working, and so we presented careers registration. So myself and Nalini Thamba, another NICEC fellow, Dr. Nalini Thamba, who is now at the University of Nottingham, who was absolutely instrumental in making this happen. We made that presentation at that time, and that was not to use a non-technical term, that was when it became a thing. And other people went away and started to adopt it. Some people could do that quite easily because, to be honest, the process is pretty simple. It's not rocket science. And other people needed some help, particularly with the political side of it. And I was able, thankfully, to help with that in a number of institutions. In 2015 and to 2018, there was a series of national projects around the idea of learning gain, originally sponsored by HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, which then the responsibility was taken over by the Office for Students when that change happened in sort of 2018. And this timeline comes from that project and was produced by Fiona Cobb and David. And you can see here what the progress was. You can see some of the other things that were going on around higher education at the time, particularly at the bottom right-hand corner there about metrics. And you can see that as we went through the project, some of it was supporting people with implementation, and a lot of it was about sharing data. But by the time we got to sort of partway through 2018, around about 84 universities in the UK had adopted careers registration. Universities in Australia were starting to adopt it. And I think the figure for the UK now is around about 90, but that gives you a rough timeline of the development. And the link that's at the bottom there is a link to the slides that were in the final conference of that learning game project. So you'd be able to look at some more of the research outputs from that project. This is just one bit of output from that project. This was at a relatively early stage. And if I remember rightly, the sample size here is around about 90,000 from several institutions. What I draw your attention to is the issue that Jane referred to earlier about reliability. And I would draw your attention to the consistency between this, which is combined data from a number of institutions with 90,000 students altogether, and the original slide that I showed you from one faculty in the University of Leeds, and the consistency of the distribution between the main headline groupings. What has happened in recent times is that a number of institutions have added a third section to the careers registration process. The most common by far is sectors of interest. So when that student goes to do their enrollment, they've got the first bit, the second bit, and then the third bit is a list of occupational sectors, and they're asked to indicate, quite often top 3, what their preferences would be for occupational sectors. And that's been really powerful data in supporting our services, our colleagues in employer engagement, because it's a pretty powerful message to be able to go to an employer and say, I can show you hard data that can tell you that 800 of our students have declared an interest in your sector. A little bit more on that sort of output. The BSc in Biomedical Sciences, this is a snapshot actually of all 3 years of a program at the same time. It's not a longitudinal one. What you can see from the sectors of interest there on the left is that the red and the blue represent the 2 main areas that you might expect, science and healthcare essentially. And that's quite narrow when you consider all the other possibilities. And in particular, when you consider that typically over a number of years, life sciences, biological sciences outside of medicine and healthcare have tended to not do quite so well in graduate outcome terms as other science subjects, whilst at the same time, the UK has the world's most subject agnostic graduate labour market, where many of the large employers would really like to recruit STEM graduates. When you put those things together and you have the data that shows you how relatively narrow the occupational horizons seem to be in that group at the moment, you might conclude that the opportunity awareness, the O in the dots model, that might be where you might want to focus some of your efforts with that group. The second chart basically just shows you the value of being able to combine the work experience bit with the sectors bit so that you can see what proportion of students have work experience in their preferred sector. Of course, one thing that people are very interested in, Serena referred to this as well, is the connection or association between career readiness and outcome. So this slide here is just a very simple snapshot of the destinations data as measured by Delhi 6 months after graduation for the same cohort, where we also have where they were in the headline career thinking categories at the beginning of their final year. And you can see that there's a pretty strong association between the more advanced career thinking, the more likely they are to be in a graduate level destination. And that really reinforces the point that was also made by the publication of the Planning for Success report, which was published by the DFE in March 2017, which again makes that point about career choice, career planning being the thing that has the strongest association to graduate success as defined by having a graduate level job. And careers registration and the learning game project very much reinforced that and basically showed, and this really helps with the thing about careers and employability rather than simply employability, really showed that This was the thing that made the most difference. And also, if you look at the numbers from careers registration, it's the area of the biggest need. So limitations and mitigations, well, it's self-report, and you know that with all of the issues that that a self-report tool has, but on the other hand, it has the huge strength of reflecting the thinking and the self-perception of all of the students, not just an engaged minority. And as you've seen, there is remarkable consistency across a very large data set. So in the end, with our learning game project, we had 15 diverse institutions in the partnership, all sorts of shapes and sizes. Unusually for a HEFCE project, it was every country of the UK and all over England, with a sample size that at the peak was 308,000, and there was remarkable consistency. It happens once a year through enrollment. So, you know, things change, obviously, of course they do. So that's a potential issue. But some institutions are able to use their career service management systems to capture data to update that status in real time. But on the other hand, of course, it can only do that with students who are engaged in order to feature in the career service management system. Point of graduation has been tricky. It's important to capture this data at the point of graduation if you can. And even more so now, given that the distance between final year and what is now the census date for graduate outcomes, which is 15 months, is much greater. But the problem is, of course, that there is no systemic equivalent to enrollment at the point of graduation. Even systems that manage attendance at graduation don't really work if you're in an institution that has relatively low attendance at graduation ceremonies. Some only have 50%. But over time, over the last few years, more and more institutions have found ways to do this. So I've seen quite a lot of impressive stuff just recently from institutions who are achieving 80% plus data capture at the point of graduation. Data analytic capability is a challenge. Of course it is, because as you've seen, doing this produces a potential tsunami of data, and you need to be in a position to analyze it and turn it into something meaningful. And not all services have that capacity, or maybe aren't able to acquire that capacity elsewhere in the institution. So that's a challenge for some, but most have found a way to overcome that. Clarity of purpose is key. Over the last few years, the only career service that's ever come to me and said our institution has turned us down for implementing careers registration. I had a conversation with the Pro-Vice Chancellor at that institution who said the reason we've turned it down is because they didn't have a clear plan of what they were going to do with the data. And I thought, well, fair enough. And there have also been some debates around terminology. Is it decide, plan, compete? Is it explore, focus, action, which King's College London uses, for example, or other variants? And there are a number of them out there, but the basic principles are the same. As I said, careers registration sections link to each other, which is useful, but they also link to the main student record. So that can be linked to other data about students, fairly obvious things like year of study and subject, but more importantly, it's really useful in relation to widening participation, equality, diversity, and inclusion. So just to give a really practical example, if you've got some really strong employability interventions going on in your institution that you can show are associated with good outcomes, you need to know who gets to take part. So combination with engagement data and outcomes, as I said, very useful. And I saw a very impressive chart from the career service at our own institution just recently, which showed by faculty, it showed career registration progress, career service engagement, and outcomes. And the three lines tracked each other almost completely. Just implemented in Portugal, first time that's been translated into another language, and there's a statistically significant correlation between the employability enhancing experience part and the careers registration part, career readiness part. We can talk about that if we need to later. We'll definitely see more work on point of graduation. We'll see more work on links to outcomes, and I think we'll see more work combining careers registration data on sectors of interest to demand data coming from labour market information. And finally, really about the impact on the profession I think Fiona Cobb sums it up very nicely in her article there. There's no going back. The transformation of HE career services using big data, not just in terms of the effect on the profession, but also I would say once you know the data, you can't unknow it. So you need to do something about it. Conversations in the ecosystem, of course, it's changed that as I've described. Professional education, I include this in my teaching of potential careers consultants because it will be part of their job. Not an external metric, as I said. And yes, it's about growing the evidence base in line with our title, but what it's really been also about is changing the evidence-based nature of our work and those conversations within higher education, careers and employability. So that's me done.
Well, thanks, Bob. That was really interesting. I've heard you talk about this before, but it's even moved on since then. And what struck me as well was, you know, something Serena said about what can feed and strengthen your practice. And it sounds like the kernel of this started with you, Bob, and your colleagues perhaps. And you think of the reach now of what you started with thinking about, and the impact is very significant. So you must feel very satisfied by that, I imagine.
Yes, yes, that's certainly true. And you know, that thing about people coming into the profession feeling that they need to get hold of the data, which isn't necessarily everybody's thing, but on the other hand, feeling empowered by it because it's showing that what they do means something and has an effect.
So does anyone want to raise their hand with a question for Bob on that? We're going to have breakouts in a minute where we can talk about it. Is there any burning question or comment people want to make, or put it in the chat box and we can pick up on it later?
It's Lynn. I asked one question in the chat box. I was curious if this has, Bob, had any impact on professors at the university level, on the faculty. Does the data go to them in terms of helping them understand the readiness of their own student population? And has it had any impact on the degree to which they begin to take career readiness and career preparation more seriously? Because that's been a real struggle in Canada to get that at that level. And I just wondered, it seems like this could be powerful data.
Yes, I think in many ways that's probably been its most important achievement. So it's changed the nature of that conversation. Because in many institutions in the UK, there are mechanisms for considering employability in the academic context, you know, an employability committee or whatever in a faculty. Then what we're doing with this data is sending the careers consultant is not going naked into the conference chamber, if you know what I mean. They are going in there armed with data that comes directly from students who are here right now. So and I've personal experience of doing this, when Professor X says, well, I know that our students, what they're really interested in is this. And then you take them to one side and you show them the data and you say, are you sure? And it's about having evidence-based conversations. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes, that's certainly the case.
Right. Well, thanks again, Bob. And maybe when we get to the final part of today, we can have a plenary and there's any outstanding questions. But it would be, I think, useful now for everyone to have a chance to have a breakout again and just have some conversations. So Ashley is on hand to put people into breakout rooms. Ashley, I think if you could do it for say 20 minutes. We're a little bit behind on time, so if we can allow 25 minutes, something like that. And I hope you enjoy. I did have some questions in mind, but I think what I'll do now is just leave it open to you to, I think, reflect on any of the learnings from the day. The topic you might want to think about is the use of big data in particular. But I think I'm going to leave it to you all just in your breakouts to have a think about what you'd like to explore and discuss, and be happy to share maybe when you come back. So enjoy your breakouts, everyone. Well, it seems like everyone's heading back. Well done for staying with us. Hope you had an interesting discussion in your breakout. So obviously keen to hear a little bit about that. We'll just wait till everyone comes back. I think that might be Ashley. Everyone's back now.
Yeah, everyone should be out now.
Okay, super. So we've just got a few more minutes towards this end of the day, and I think it's timely for us to maybe just do that reflective piece of what's the day meant, what's our experience of the day, what's buzzing in your minds. So I'm going to invite you to maybe just share one thing that you've really gained from today, the thing that's the sort of top of your mind. I'm happy for people to speak if they want to, because the group's got a lot smaller now, or to put that in the chat box, or if you want to share something that's really resonated with you from your breakout room, it'd be good to hear as well. So would anyone like to talk to the group to kick us off? Don't be shy. For any of you.
Well, it's Lynn Bezanson here from Canada. I'd like to just say one thing, and I didn't attend all the sessions, but what really struck me both from Serena's presentation and from Bob's is how the intervention really began on working with tools that you already had, instead of trying to create something new. I mean, what Bob talked about when he talked about moving to registration. I mean, that's a simple idea, but it's a brilliant idea, because you have all this data that's suddenly there. And I was thinking of what Serena's presentation was as well, that when that tool was developed, it was very much developed with the frontline practitioners. And I remember very vividly after the first pilot that we had with that tool, and it's changed dramatically and improved since then, but it was one of the frontline counselors who said, why don't you color code those indicators so that you can actually visually see progress? And I still remember Serena and I saying, my God, why didn't we think of that, Mm-hmm. So sometimes those things can be right in front of us and we don't see the simpler ways that we can begin to have impact. And I thought that that was very useful to just remind us that sometimes it doesn't have to be so esoteric. We can use tools that are there and that don't necessarily need to be expensive. So that's just one thing I took away from listening today. So thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. And actually that made me think about what Peter was talking about this morning when he was talking a lot about Holland. We've got this well-established framework that's very well validated, that there's so much data that backs it up, but we aren't necessarily going back to that and using that. So I thought that was interesting as well, to your point. Anyone else want to say something? You can put your cameras on if you want. Or
Rosemary, one of the things in our group, somebody asked a question, which was something that I'd been thinking about, so that was rather nice, which was about the fact that in Careers Reg, we capture where students are at that point of transition into university after school and FE. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only place where that information sits. And might it be an idea that we look at doing something around ways in which some of that can be shared back with our colleagues in schools and FE? So that was an interesting question, and one that I already started to think about, and it's something we might want to try and put a project together around.
And just on that, Bob, I think just to add to that, because I work in organizations, there's a big focus on people early in their career in organizations and some of the challenges they face. Anecdotally, it seems that they're a bit on a one track. They're still on that, they still haven't worked it all out.
Well, I think
they're on a treadmill and they don't know what to do when that training program comes to the end.
Yeah, I think two things there, Rosemary. One is that I think that over time, many of us in higher education career services, our interface with employers has been at that transactional point, when in fact, much of what we do professionally has as much or more in common with the graduate developer who is developing people within an organization, and we should probably think about that a bit more. And the other one was really about whether the data that we have, and I'm thinking about the occupational sector data now, is an interesting thing to look at as a leading indicator of potential talent supply. Because otherwise, from higher education, the only other thing you could do would be look at the numbers of people studying a particular subject, which only really works for healthcare in any discipline graduate job market by and large. So people's declared occupational sector interests at the scale we're talking about might be a more reliable indicator of potential talent supply than subjective study would be. So that's a That's the thought that might be used, more about interaction with the business community, perhaps at a regional level.
Yeah, definitely. Anyone else want to share anything? Because it's good to hear people's voices. People have been putting things in the chat, I can see as well. Anyone else want to say anything from what went on in your breakout, or something it's prompted you to think about?
Should I chip in something again? If that's all right. One of the speakers, and I'm not quite sure who, said, data is power. And I thought that really echoed in a number of ways throughout the day, really, wasn't it? In terms of, you can influence vice chancellors, you can influence practitioners, you can influence funding bodies. If you have the right data, it really is a tool that you can use for good. And finding out what you're passionate about and what you really are keen to know more about, combined with this idea of the data itself being very powerful, is something that I got out of today very strongly. I hope it's encouraging to people to think that you're sitting on all that data and you know how to get it, probably, if you stop to think. So you're in a very strong position to do something good out of all this stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Serena, did you want to say something? I saw you put your camera on.
I just wanted to say how grateful I am as a Canadian sitting very far away geographically from you, how grateful I am to be able to be part of this session. And if there's not many things that I love about COVID, but one of the few things that I have really appreciated is that it does seem to have opened up opportunities like this as we go online and virtual for so many of these events. It would have been highly unlikely that I could have gotten on a plane and come to be with you if this were in person. And what a rich learning experience it is for us to be able to be connecting over international borders this way. And we picked up on that in our breakout room, talking about it much more on a micro level, how working virtually with students or clients is opening up new avenues as well. In busy schools, there often aren't a lot of places to really connect in an intimate way, which you can do over Zoom. You're sometimes even in each other's homes, and it gives you ways to connect with parents that you might not otherwise, and create family conversations. And so just reflecting on the opportunities that exist through these tough times as well.
Yeah, agreed. And I see Claire's on the line. Claire, the things like the community of practice in the CDI has really taken off, hasn't it, through COVID, I think, whether it's a reason for it. I've noticed that. Claire, do you want to say anything about that? Because I think that is maybe a...
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I wasn't expecting to appear on camera, but there. No, the communities of practice have really taken off. We've got Facebook ones, internet-based ones that people use regularly to ask questions. And as Lynn mentioned before lunch, the fact that we're going to have research groups meeting quarterly as well. And they're webinar based, they're Zoom based, so there's no reason why international colleagues can't join those as well. So technology has just really enabled much more sharing of excellent practice than ever before. So something that we will continue post-COVID. As you say, it's one of the few good things to have come out of a nasty situation, but worth continuing.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Anyone else want to share anything or make a comment before we... I'm going to tell you about our next... Yeah.
Yeah, can I just say one thing? I think one of the little strands that's come out, especially through this afternoon, but maybe Peter as well, is the real importance of starting things from where people are, where the client is. It's so easy to think of so much research and evaluation just being dumped from outside with the outside person's perspective. That's been one of my takeaways from the day. Really powerful, that.
Thanks, Lynn. Anyone else want to say anything?
I just ask a question about the research webinars or events, the 4 quarterly ones. I'd be really interested in that. But how would we register for that? Or is it just something that will come out from the CDI in the newsletters? Or
they will appear on our training and events page.
right.
Lynn and I are busy working on the paragraphs describing each of the events. Lynn doing the majority of the work on that, and then I'll have them added to the website. So we're hoping that probably sort of mid-May we should have all the details, and we'd like to put the details of all 4 of the events up on the site and the dates and times, so that people can get them in their diaries nice and early with plenty of notice.
Lovely. And unfortunately, I missed the session just after lunch, which sounded like it was really interesting, but I had another meeting and it clashed, unfortunately. So will this session be available on the website as well?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah, again, if you go to the training and events page, give it probably up to a week, because it takes a little while to download all the recordings and edit them and put them back up on the site. But if you look by the end of next week, everything should be there and available from the whole day.
Yeah, we need to edit,
Thank you.
we need to edit out our conversation about Prince Philip's funeral that we were having at lunchtime. It's not relevant. Anyone else want anything to say or comment on?
Just a thought. Hi, it's Keith here. I'm kind of betwixt and between in terms of observing data and commentary around the labour market. On the one hand, there's out at the moment in the latest Economist a special section on the future of work, which is quite interestingly quite optimistic about the future of work in a post-COVID world. And of course, they're only looking at 37 OECD countries, so pretty much advanced economies. But the benefits of remote working, of technology, all sorts of things, of potentially reviving economies, etc. And yet, by contrast, I also see sort of deep, dark anxiety about the transition of young people into the labour market, whether that's from college or school or universities. The anxiety that many young people have about their futures, given the complexities and the difficulties and challenges of the current labour market. And what I don't see much of is strategy and appropriate intervention and support from governments around, I guess, sort of navigating or sort of nurturing and showing how they are going to take us through this process. There seems to be sort of a fairly sort of laissez-faire, oh, well, things will just come back to normal, won't they? And I'm sort of kind of really intrigued by that. And then by contrast, what kinds of support programs to be put in place? So I see lots of adverts for job coaches at the Department for Work and Pensions in England, for example, as a solution. But again, it's not holistic, it's not integrated, it's not connected to industrial strategy or to understanding how the government, manages the economy so that we can have and see a future. I just see a joyful darkness, but maybe that's just me being wondrously optimistic.
I mean, we could do a whole session on this, couldn't we? I mean, it sounds like a really important topic we should perhaps explore in more depth, because it's that dissonance, isn't it, between two sets of data, I guess, in a way, if we keep it to the topic of data, about what's predicted about the future of work and what's actually the reality in that gap. I can see that. I'm not sure we can solve that today, but it's an interesting concern, isn't it, for sure, for young people. That just because the news, there's more data came out today about this, wasn't there?
Today about something like 4 in all 5 people who've lost their jobs are under 24, something like that.
Yeah.
And in fact, going into the real problems, there's always tended to be an assumption that older workers, that I've done a fair amount of research with, will be quite significantly hit. And that hasn't really been the case. It really is young people who've taken the hit. So for young people not yet even in the labour market, coming into the labour market from school, university or whatever this year, I think it's looking, well, very, very worrying. I share Keith's concern.
Let's not end on a gloomy note, although it's a reality. So I think it's a topic we should come back to in NICEC. Jane, did you want to say something? Because I was just going to, we need to round things off quickly, I think, so we finish on time. But Jane, did you want to say something?
Oh, just remembering to unmute myself, I would just like to say thank you to you, Rosemary, for chairing this so ably and so well throughout the day. There's been an absolute barrage of really interesting stuff on the chat that you've been keeping on top of. You've been keeping us all to time very beautifully, and
Trying.
did the whole day. So well done, Rosemary.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you to all the speakers as well. I think.
Well, I think that's where, you know, really it's been so pleasurable working with colleagues, international fellows and UK fellows on this project. It's been really helpful. And just a final thought then, I also want to tell you when the next NICEC event is. But one of the things that struck me that came out of, I think, a lot of the presentations today was that the role of self-efficacy, which I guess is a bit related to what Keith was raising about young people, and the sort of role of building hope in people and helping people change. And for me, that is a big focus of my work. And I was just really struck with that was coming a lot today, I think, wasn't it, about how we influence self-efficacy in people as part of what we're doing. So that's a positive story. Now, let me just quickly show you the next NICEC event. I put this on a slide. Well, maybe I can just tell you. It's a really interesting one. It's, if you go on the NICEC website, it's on the 17th of May, called New Thinking, Career Development, Context, Theory and Practice. And it's based on a book, forthcoming book, which is really, it's sort of built on our Rethinking conference we did a couple of years ago, just really up-to-date thinking about career development right now, drawing together theory and practice. So that's going to have lots of contributors to that from the NICEC fellows, including Peter again, I think. So do join us at that. It's 2 to 5 UK time on the 17th of May. So you can book onto that through the NICEC website. So on that note, we've run over by a minute, so I think we should draw things to a close. And thank you, Ashley, at the CDI for organising us as well, and the breakouts quietly in the background. So thank you, Ashley. And thank you again for all your participation, and we'll see you at another NICEC event in the future. So bye for now, everyone.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.